Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Wherever you are, winding down for sleep, easing into work, driving through long roads, or just watching quietly from some quiet place on Earth, this story is yours now. So let your thoughts unclench. You won't need to rush here. This is slow storytelling, built to calm the brain and feed it gently. You can follow every thread, or drift off for a while. Honestly, if that happens, I've left timestamps in the description. That way, tomorrow, you can find your way back, because this entire journey, from beginning to end, is worth finishing. And if you're someone who appreciates long-form, fact-based stories told softly, this is where you help it grow. A like or subscribe helps this kind of science, slow, humble, and real, reach more curious minds. Not loud answers, not wild speculation, but soft science that knows when to say we don't know yet, and still keeps looking. So if you use this channel before bed, during a night shift, on a long walk, in the shower, or just quietly through your headphones, tell me in the comments how you listen, or where in the world you're tuning in from. It helps shape this community of wandering minds, of modern humans, curious and tired. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, tonight's story is buried beneath 5 million square miles of silence. This is the forgotten time when the Sahara was green. You are standing where a lake once was, not beside it, not near it, but inside its memory. The ground beneath your feet is hard now, cracked like old leather, grooved with the scars of vanished water. But the bones of the lake remain. You can see them in the curves of the basin, the feathered lines of dried tributaries, the glint of ancient shells half buried in silence. The wind moves across the basin like a breath trying to recall a story it once told every day. But now, the story has no words. You walk barefoot, not for symbolism, but because there are no roads here. There never were. Only rhythms, only knowing. Your steps fall into patterns you do not consciously choose, as if the land is still humming with instructions too old for language. You pause beside a smooth depression, cupped like a hand. It held water once. You know this, not because someone told you, but because your skin remembers the feel of silt that stays cool long after the sun has passed. Your breath slows. The air smells like nothing. Not dust, not decay, just the blankness that follows forgetting. But the land did not always forget. Once it was a teacher. It spoke in cloud formations and the scent of wet grass before a storm. It showed you which reed grew after the floods and which insect sang first when the humidity changed. No one wrote this down. No one needed to. It lived in bodies, in fingers that knew when to press the soil and when to leave it, in tongues that tasted the edge of bitterness in a root and called it time to move, in elders who could smell the season shifting 3 days before it did. The desert you stand in now was once a place of knowledge, not abstract, not measured, but lived. Knowledge that came by walking the same path year after year and noticing when the ants changed direction. Somewhere here, a fire once burned. You don't see it, but you feel the shape it left behind. A patch of earth darker than the rest, a ring of stones nudged just so. Here, someone boiled water, told a story, pressed the edge of a bone tool into softened hide. Maybe a child sat nearby, counting cicadas. Maybe someone hummed. Fire was not an event. It was a language. You fed it, it spoke. You ignored it, it vanished. It kept no record, but it left warmth in memory, like a handprint long after the hand is gone. You kneel, not for reverence, just to feel closer to what was. The soil here is light, dry, but if you dig even a few centimeters, it shifts, becomes finer, denser. It carries traces of ash, of pollen, of roots that once drank deeply. These are not metaphors, they are data. Residue of trees that once shaded herders and animals. Remains of plants that only grow when there is water nearby. This is not romanticism, it is chemistry. The Sahara was green, and you are touching the proof. But the proof does not speak. It waits. It waits for someone who remembers how to ask the question without expecting an answer. The people who lived here did not name it Sahara. They did not see it as a desert. They saw it as cycles, as the return of rains, as the pulse of hooves in softened ground. Some followed the grass. Some stayed near the lakes. Some built small walls of stone, not to conquer, but to guide. Their homes were not cities. Their monuments were not pyramids. Their maps were not ink. They were grooves in memory. A route passed on through gesture, through laughter, through the way someone moved when they said, "Not here, the water comes from there." And then one day, it didn't. The rain didn't come, not suddenly, not like a story about wrath or punishment, but slowly, too slowly to notice at first. One less storm, one missed migration, one lake that did not quite fill. There was no alarm, no message, just a shifting quiet. And then, the knowledge became less useful. The root that signaled flood season stopped blooming. The cloud pattern that meant abundance drifted away and never returned. Rituals were repeated, fires were lit, eyes searched the sky, but the rain had forgotten their names. What do you do when the sky stops knowing you? When the rhythm you lived by becomes a silence? You don't call it collapse. There is no word for that. You move, you adapt, you wait. But the waiting grows longer. The animals don't come back. The grasses don't regrow. You tell the story again. But the children begin to forget the details. Not because they are careless, but because the world they were meant to memorize no longer appears. The mnemonic is broken. The season no longer matches the song. And so the song is no longer sung. Fire becomes elegy. You gather around it not just to eat or warm your hands, but to remember what rain sounded like. Someone mimics the sound. Someone else says, "It used to fall hard here, remember?" But the youngest among you only know wind, only know dust. They have never seen the fish that once swam where you now sit. They have never heard frogs at dusk. They believe you, but they do not feel it. The land no longer teaches, it only forgets. And yet, you stay a while longer, because memory is not only in weather, it is in you. You teach the names of trees that no longer grow. You point to the empty sky and describe clouds that no longer come. You teach your child how to prepare a skin for tanning even though there are no animals to hunt. Because teaching is not just survival, it is ritual, a way of insisting that you were here, that there was once a rhythm, that the silence you now walk through was once full of conversation. Eventually, you leave. Not because you want to, but because to stay is to vanish completely. You do not leave a marker. No stone to say, "We were here," no monument, no script, only the curved basin of a forgotten lake, only the dark patch of ancient fire, only the faintest trace of pollen buried beneath a silence so deep it could be mistaken for peace. But it is not peace. It is erasure. It is what happens when memory is held in sand instead of stone. Now, thousands of years later, someone like you returns. A scientist, a wanderer, a tired dreamer tracing satellite images or following a rumor about green places in the middle of a sea of dust. You stand where they stood. You see what they could not mark. You touch the ground where their footsteps were blown away long before the first brick was ever laid in the first city. You listen, not for answers, just for the shape of what was lost. And if you listen long enough, you might hear it. Not words, not even sounds, just a pattern, a suggestion, a rhythm your body leans toward, the memory of rain, the logic of a vanished lake, the warmth of a fire that once meant home. And maybe, for a moment, you remember too. Not because it was written, but because it mattered. The wind moves differently out here, not as a gust, not as weather, more like breath, like the land exhaling in a language you almost recognize. You are not supposed to be here, not really. There is no trail, no plaque, no ruin with an arrow pointing in, just sand, just the hush of distance. But you have come anyway, because something once happened here and no one remembers it. You crouch. The ground is hot. And beneath your feet, a memory is trying not to vanish. Not a story in words, not a monument carved in stone, but something softer. A worn place where a hand might have shaped a tool. A flatness where a pot might have sat in coals. A darker patch of earth where blood or berries or fire once seeped into soil. There is nothing left to see. And yet everything is here. You touch the dirt and try to imagine what this wind once carried. Smoke from camel thorn fires, laughter maybe, the slap of wet skins being scraped, the whistle of a child learning to throw. These are not things archaeology finds easily. They do not fossilize. They do not survive looters. But they are not gone. They are just quiet. And quiet, if you listen long enough, can speak. The sand buries almost everything. It does not care for symmetry or prestige. It buries kings and mothers alike. It buries myths and facts together. But it is not cruel. It is not erasure. It is time. Time, settling like dust on all the things we forget to hold. So much of prehistory is made of absence, of what isn't there. No script, no palace, no metal, no road, just gaps, just the space between one shard and the next. But those gaps are not empty. They are filled with choice. The choice to stay small, the choice to pass stories instead of armies, the choice to remember without writing. You sit, and the wind moves again, this time slower. Like it too is thinking. You wonder who they were, the ones who lived here when it was green, when there were lakes, reeds, hippos, when people tracked stars not to map conquests, but to know when the rains would come, when you didn't need walls because the land was home, when civilization was not a skyline but a circle around a fire. They had no kings, but they had rules. They had no cities, but they had centers, places where trade passed, where lovers met, where grief pooled. You will never know their names, but you have seen their children, in the way a herder in the Sahel reads the sky, in the way a Berber weaves a pattern into wool, in the way music echoes across sand dunes with no one to hear but stars. Lineages do not always end. Sometimes they go quiet. There is a myth that to be civilized is to build, that to be remembered is to endure in marble. But stone cracks, statues fall. What survives longest is what no one thinks to steal. A campfire ring buried in silt, a pattern of pollen under stone, the oil from one handprint, long since dust, but once pressed in prayer against the flank of a cliff. These are not ruins, they are traces. They are what the wind still knows. It knows that a girl once danced here, barefoot, to a rhythm now extinct, that someone carved an ibex into bone with such care it hurt, that the old ones told stories at twilight that made the children lean close, mouths open, not from fear, but from awe. And then, one day, the rains stopped. The people left, or tried to stay too long. The grass browned, the lakes shrank, the elephants wandered north and found nothing. The fire circles went cold, and the wind began to speak in a new tongue, the one that forgets. You are still sitting there. You have not moved. There is nothing to see. But you are not alone, because now you carry something. Not data, not proof, but recognition. The shape of presence inside absence. The knowledge that someone was here, and that they mattered, even if no one remembers how. You carry the unbearable intimacy of having touched a place that has been silent for 8,000 years. You rise, slowly. The sand shifts. Maybe you leave no trace. Maybe your own presence will vanish by morning. But for now, for this moment, you are witness. Not to a civilization, but to a possibility. That the past does not need to shout to be heard. That even silence has weight. As you walk away, the wind follows. Not behind you, through you, like a memory that still remembers how to feel. And somewhere, far beneath your feet, a bone rests where it fell. A tool lies where it broke. And the fire, though long gone, still knows your name. It just forgot how to say it. They say deserts don't hide things, they erase them. Wind and time level what was once here until even memory fails. But what if that wasn't true? What if the Sahara, this vast, dry, silent ocean of sand stretching across the top of Africa, was not always so empty? What if it once held rivers, lakes, hippos, forests, and people? And what if that entire world is still there, quietly buried just beneath the surface? It's easy to forget how young our understanding of deep time really is. Just over a century ago, many maps still labeled the Sahara in a single word: uninhabitable. It was drawn as a dead zone, a natural barrier, something that had always been there. But maps lie, or more accurately, they freeze things that are moving. Deserts don't stay deserts forever, and every grain of sand here, all 5 million square miles of it, carries traces of something else, something wetter, something forgotten. The first clues didn't come from the ground, they came from the air. In the early days of satellite imaging, geologists started to notice strange patterns beneath the dunes. In places where there should have been nothing, long, sinuous lines traced invisible paths across the desert floor. These lines had no reason to exist, unless they had once been rivers. Some curled and split like ancient deltas, others bent toward shallow depressions now filled with wind-blown dust. And in some images, you could see the faint outline of what must have been enormous lakes. Not puddles, lakes hundreds of kilometers across. At first, these were just patterns, curiosities for remote sensing experts. But slowly, something bigger began to emerge. The Sahara, it seemed, was not just shaped by wind and sun. It had once been a place of water, not a brief flood or a scattered oasis, but an entire climate regime, a Green Sahara, and not just once. It happened again and again. By the early 2000s, things became harder to deny. Sediment cores drilled from beneath desert lakes, some now completely dry, revealed alternating bands of life and desolation. Layers rich in pollen, charcoal, and freshwater algae told the story of a lush environment, followed by a sudden and total collapse into aridity. Deep beneath the sands of northeastern Mali, researchers extracted lakebed cores that showed open water, papyrus swamps, and fire-adapted savanna from more than 5,000 years ago. And further east, in what is now northern Chad, a team studying the ancient lakebed of Megalake Chad found deposits that spoke of a lake once larger than all of the Great Lakes of North America combined. But even before these cores, the evidence was already sitting on the surface. You just had to know where to look. In southern Algeria, massive rock outcrops shelter one of the richest collections of prehistoric rock art anywhere on Earth. Carved and painted across millennia, these images are neither stylized nor vague. They are precise and, at times, shockingly modern. Elephants with long, curved tusks, crocodiles, giraffes, cattle being milked, families seated around what looks like a domesticated hearth. In some images, boats drift along wide, curving rivers, drawn in places that have not seen running water since before the pyramids were built. These were not the drawings of wandering herders imagining another land. These were records, memories. They show what was, and what was green. This phenomenon is now known as the African Humid Period, though that term, like many scientific labels, hides as much as it reveals. It was not a singular moment. It happened in cycles, governed by complex shifts in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of its axis. At certain intervals, roughly every 21,000 years, northern Africa tilts slightly closer to the sun during the northern hemisphere's summer. This subtle shift strengthens the monsoon rains that sweep north from the equator, and when those rains reach far enough, they transform everything. For millennia, the Sahara would bloom. Rainfall increased tenfold. Grasses, trees, and rivers covered the desert. Lakes swelled. Animals migrated in, and people followed. They hunted, they fished, and eventually, they stayed. This was not fringe theory. By the end of the 20th century, enough data had accumulated that climate scientists began to reclassify northern Africa not as one uninterrupted desert, but as a climate pendulum, one that swung between green and gold, between life and death. Still, for decades, the human side of this story remained vague. The sand preserved little in the way of bones or tools. Archaeological excavation in the central Sahara has always been difficult. The terrain is remote, the logistics are punishing, and more recently, political instability has made fieldwork impossible in vast regions. But the clues began to mount. In one location, freshwater mollusk shells were found in the middle of the desert, their species now extinct in Africa. In another, charred remnants of fish bones were discovered in hearth pits dated to 6,000 years ago. In Mauritania, fossilized footprints of children were found on the edge of a long-vanished wetland. Their stride, their size, and the sediment pattern suggest they were walking on soft, muddy ground just after a rain. More recently, tools have begun to tell their own story. Scattered across the desert are lithic fragments from cultures we still cannot name. Flaked arrowheads, grinding stones, the remains of fishing gear, all pointing to a life not of constant movement, but of semi-settlement. These were not just passers-by. They lived here, for generations. And then, they left. Or more accurately, They were forced to. Because after every Green Sahara, the pendulum swings back. Slowly, the monsoons weaken, the rain line retreats, the rivers vanish, lakes dry into salt flats, and the desert begins to return, creeping in from every direction. You would not have noticed it day to day. A slightly shorter wet season, a few less shoots of green, the animals harder to track. But over a century, the change was total, and over 5 centuries, the land would become unrecognizable. By around 5,000 years before the present, the Sahara had entered its modern phase. The rains never came back, the lakes did not refill, the people either adapted or disappeared, and the sand covered everything. This, perhaps, is the hardest part to accept. Not that the Sahara was once green, that much is now firmly established. The harder part is knowing how little we've preserved. If you think of history as a book, then the Sahara is missing entire chapters. Whole cultures rose, lived, and vanished in a space we have barely begun to touch. No cities, no monuments, no written language, just fragments, pottery sherds, rock art, a shell here, a footprint there. And yet, science is beginning to read the sand, not just through excavation, but through light. Today, advanced satellite platforms like LiDAR and radar interferometry can scan beneath the dunes and identify subtle shifts in elevation, buried riverbeds, and ancient lake margins. Combined with paleoclimate models, we can now reconstruct what parts of the Sahara would have been habitable year by year over the last 20,000 years. And soon, we may be able to go further. But even with this technology, one question lingers. What are we not seeing? What still lies just a few inches deeper than our tools can reach? A burial? A village? A new branch of the human story? The Sahara has always challenged the limits of our perception. It teaches patience and humility. Every dune here once held water. Every rock was once part of something green. And if we have only just begun to understand this landscape, then what else are we still missing? That's where the story begins, with a world hidden in plain sight and a question that echoes across time. What happens to a civilization that disappears without a trace? And more hauntingly, what if it never truly disappeared? Just waited, buried, under the sand. The desert breathed once, not just at the surface, but all the way down to its roots. From the shores of the Atlantic to the Red Sea's distant edge, a band of green nearly the size of Australia opened its lungs to the sky and exhaled life. And for a time, a very long time, the Sahara was not a desert at all. It was a breathing, blooming continent. But what made it bloom? What mechanism, buried deep in the planet's rhythms, could coax such a vast landscape into a temporary Eden? That answer, as far as we can tell, begins not on Earth, but in the slow ballet of its orbit around the Sun. To understand why the Sahara was once green, we have to think not in years or even centuries, but in cycles, deep planetary cycles that shape the boundaries of climate itself. Earth's orbit is not fixed. It wobbles, it stretches, it tilts and shifts in ways that are invisible to us in a lifetime, but unmistakable in the geological record. These are the Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic, who in the early 20th century proposed that ice ages and interglacials were driven not by local weather, but by slow, predictable changes in Earth's relationship to the Sun. 3 cycles control the rhythm: eccentricity, obliquity, and precession. Eccentricity describes the shape of Earth's orbit. It moves from nearly circular to slightly elliptical over a cycle of about 100,000 years. Obliquity is the tilt of Earth's axis, which ranges from about 22 to 25 degrees over a 41,000-year period. But the one that matters most for the Sahara is precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, which completes a full cycle roughly every 21,000 years. This precession determines when the Earth is closest to the Sun during different seasons, and when the northern hemisphere receives more solar radiation during its summer months, something strange and powerful happens. The African monsoon strengthens. The monsoon is not just a season, it is a system, a feedback loop of sun, ocean, and air that moves billions of tons of water vapor across the continent every year. During northern hemisphere summer, land heats up faster than the ocean. This draws moist air from the Atlantic inland, forming towering columns of storm clouds that march northward into West Africa. When this system strengthens, the rains push farther than they should. They sweep deep into what we now call the Sahara, turning dunes into meadows and salt flats into lakes. This is what scientists call the African humid period. And it did not just last a season or a century, it lasted nearly 10,000 years. According to climate reconstructions, the most recent and best understood humid period began around 14,700 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age. As global temperatures began to rise and glaciers retreated across Europe and North America, the monsoon belt in Africa expanded dramatically. Pollen records from lake beds across the Sahel and Saharan fringe tell the same story. Grasses, sedges, and acacia trees replaced desert scrub. The spread of freshwater algae and diatoms shows that rainfall was not only more abundant, it was consistent. And the evidence isn't limited to Africa. In marine sediment cores off the coast of West Africa, scientists have found layers rich in what are known as terrestrial biomarkers, tiny molecules produced by land plants, swept into the ocean by rivers and dust storms. These layers become sharply more abundant during the humid period, showing that greenery once reached nearly to the ocean's edge. Even the color of these layers changes. In place of dry, sandy beige, you find rich organic black, a fingerprint of a greener continent. Satellite imagery, paleosols, and dune activity all support the same conclusion. Between about 14,700 and 5,000 years ago, much of the Sahara was vegetated, not as dense jungle or forest, but as a savanna biome, open woodlands, seasonal wetlands, and wide grassy plains that could support large herbivores and permanent water bodies. Some regions received monsoon rainfall comparable to what modern-day Kenya experiences today, and in certain years, even more. The mechanisms behind this transformation are not fully settled. Climate models, even the best of them, have historically struggled to recreate just how green the Sahara became. Many older simulations underestimated the intensity of the monsoon or failed to generate the right feedback loops to maintain long periods of wetness. But recent advances have helped. Models that include dynamic vegetation, where plant growth can influence the local climate by altering albedo and water retention, perform better. The more the land greens, the more it holds moisture, reinforcing rainfall and delaying desertification. This is known as a biogeophysical feedback loop, and it's critical to understanding how the Sahara could remain green for thousands of years. And yet, these greenings were never eternal. Just as orbital precession ushered in rainfall, it also ended it. Around 5,000 years ago, the precession cycle shifted. The northern hemisphere summer moved further from the sun. The monsoon weakened, the rains withdrew, and the greening began to unravel. What was once a breathing savanna slowly became dust. The lakes shrank, leaving behind mineral rings like bathtub stains around the dry basins. The rivers stopped flowing, the wind returned, and the desert reclaimed its place. But not evenly. One of the peculiar features of the African humid period is how spatially varied it was. Certain regions, particularly around the ancient Lake Megachad, remained wet longer than others. In parts of eastern Sahara, especially near the Tibesti and Enedi highlands, local microclimates preserved patches of vegetation even as the wider monsoon system collapsed. This variability means that the Sahara is never one place. Its transformation into green and then back into gold was always a mosaic of shifting zones, some holding on longer than others, some blinking out before the rest. Lake Megachad is one of the best examples. At its peak, this body of water stretched over 300,000 square kilometers, making it larger than all of modern-day Britain. Its deepest parts may have held water year-round for centuries, supporting a permanent wetland ecosystem in the heart of what is now the Sahel. When the monsoon finally failed here, it didn't disappear overnight. The lake fragmented into smaller basins, each shrinking at its own pace, eventually leaving behind the modern Lake Chad, a pale, seasonal echo of what once was. These changes are not just historical, they are still ongoing. The Sahara remains a dynamic landscape. Every grain of dust that blows off its surface into the Atlantic is part of a living system, one that has switched states again and again over geological time. Even today, some paleoclimatologists believe we are overdue for another humid phase, though any future greening will now be shaped not only by Earth's orbital cycles, but by human-driven climate change. There is a haunting precision to how the African humid period is written into the earth, layer by layer, rain by rain. You can find its record in lake sediments, in tree pollen, in dust trapped in Greenland ice cores. You can measure the isotopic shifts in fossilized snail shells, or the oxygen ratios in stalagmites from Moroccan caves. Every technique confirms the same basic picture. For nearly 10,000 years, the Sahara pulsed with life. And then, it stopped. Still, one question lingers. A quiet one, asked not by models or maps, but by the silence of the landscape itself. Why does something so large vanish so completely? The rocks do not speak. The wind does not explain. And what we are left with is a mystery of scale. How does a region that once covered 9 million square kilometers in green simply return to gold and leave behind almost no trace? Perhaps the answer is simpler than we think. The desert does not destroy everything. It just buries it very, very well. And so the Sahara waits. Its humid past stored in mud layers and river scars and ancient pollen sealed beneath dust. We can model its rhythms, trace its rainfall, and recreate its biomes in simulation. But what we cannot do, not yet, is touch its breath. We know it breathed. The signs are everywhere. But the lungs have collapsed. The mouth has closed. And the question remains, will it ever breathe again? Before the first pottery, before the first herds, before anyone thought to call it a desert, there was water. Not the illusion of water shimmering in the heat, but real, deep, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, teeming with aquatic life and bordered by reeds tall enough to sway against the wind. And yet today, nearly every trace of these ancient lakes lies buried under silence, dried, cracked, and folded into the sand as if they had never been there at all. But they were, and some of them were among the largest bodies of fresh water this continent has ever seen. In the early decades of the 21st century, a question began to take root among geologists and paleoclimatologists working in Africa's Sahel and Saharan basins. If the Sahara had truly been green, not just briefly moist, but sustained, rich, and vegetated for thousands of years, then where did all the water go? Not the monsoon rainfall itself, but the lakes, the rivers, the networks of runoff and catchment that must have formed in response. Climate models had confirmed the rain. Sediment cores showed vegetation. But the full hydrological infrastructure, the arteries of a living landscape, remained elusive. What began to emerge was a map of what you might call a vanished hydrosphere, not just isolated lakes or marshes, but entire inland seas that rose and fell with the rhythm of the African humid period. And at the heart of this story was one colossal name, Mega Lake Chad. Today's Lake Chad, nestled between Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad, is a pale echo of its former self. Modern surface area estimates hover around 1 to 2,000 square kilometers, and even that fluctuates dramatically with seasonal rain. But during the peak of the last humid phase, sometime between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago, this lake may have stretched over 350,000 square kilometers. To place that in perspective, it would have dwarfed all the Great Lakes of North America. It would have rivaled the size of the Caspian Sea. The reconstruction of Mega Lake Chad came not from a single discovery, but from layers of indirect clues. Satellite radar mapping revealed ancient shorelines etched into the landscape, concentric bands of elevation that had no business being so regular unless shaped by standing water. These paleo shorelines, now almost invisible to the naked eye, circle the basin like ghost rings on a bathtub. In some places, wave-cut terraces and beach ridges are still traceable, even beneath shifting dunes. Next came the sediments. Core samples taken from beneath the basin floor revealed alternating bands of clay and silt, rich in freshwater diatoms, snail shells, and pollen from aquatic and semi-aquatic plants. Radiocarbon dating placed these layers squarely within the early Holocene, the first few millennia after the Ice Age ended. The consistency and composition of these deposits left little doubt. This was no seasonal floodplain. This was a permanent, vast, freshwater lake. And it was not alone. Across the central Sahara, in places we now think of as utterly desolate, there are the footprints of other megaliths. The Fezzan Basin in southwestern Libya, for instance, once held a chain of interconnected lakes that reached their peak between 11,000 and 7,000 years ago. In Mauritania, Paleolake deposits suggest temporary water bodies large enough to support year-round habitats. Even in the Tanasrooft and Tenere, two of the most hostile and bone-dry regions on the planet today, the remnants of ancient lake beds have been identified through radar imaging and aerial photography. It's easy to forget just how fragile fresh water is. A lake can hold for centuries, even millennia, but once its input stops, its memory fades fast. Evaporation concentrates salts, shorelines retreat, vegetation gives way to dust. Within a few generations, a lake can be gone, and unless someone drills into the sediment, there's little to tell the story above ground. Yet perhaps the most intriguing part of this vanished hydrology lies not in the lakes, but in the rivers that once connected them. What we now call paleo-drainage systems, ancient river networks carved during wetter climates, crisscross the Sahara beneath the surface, detectable only through remote sensing or subsurface mapping. These are not active rivers today. Many haven't flowed in over 5,000 years, but their paths are unmistakable. Tributaries converge, meanders cut into bedrock, and in some places, the ghost of a delta still spreads. The most famous of these is the so-called Tamanrasset River system. Based on satellite data and hydrological modeling, this ancient river likely began in the Hoggar highlands of Algeria, flowed southwest through what is now the Algerian Sahara, and discharged into the Atlantic near the Mauritanian coast. At its peak, this river system may have rivaled the modern-day Niger in volume and scale. Today, it lies entirely beneath desert sands. There are no waterfalls, no gorges, no riverbanks, just a memory in the ground. Then there is the Nile. The Nile, of course, still exists, but its ancient tributaries tell a different story. During the African humid period, the Nile's flow was augmented by now-vanished rivers that drained regions of the Sahara we would never associate with water today. The Wadi Hawar in Sudan, for example, was once a major tributary, a river that flowed from the Ennedi Plateau in Chad eastward into the Nile Basin. Satellite imaging reveals a channel over 1,000 kilometers long, with fluvial features such as oxbow lakes, meanders, and floodplain deposits. Hydrological reconstructions suggest that the Wadi Hawar may have been active well into the mid-Holocene, ceasing only around 4,500 years ago. Before that, it likely carried seasonal floodwaters and runoff from the Sahel uplands directly into the Nile, contributing to its volume and expanding its floodplain beyond what we recognize today. These forgotten rivers and lakes were not just geological quirks, they were ecosystems. Every lake supported fisheries, every tributary carved a valley. The standing water allowed soil to form, trees to grow, and life to anchor itself in places that would soon forget it ever lived there. We know this, not through the presence of people, we haven't reached them yet, but from the ecology embedded in the mud. Fossilized algae, diatoms, ostracods, and freshwater mollusks all confirm the presence of aquatic systems stable enough to support year-round biological communities. In the sediments of paleo lakes, scientists have recovered the pollen of aquatic plants like typha and cyperus, both dependent on permanent water bodies. These are not species that survive dry seasons. They are indicators of deep, stable hydration. Even the presence of crocodile fossils in central Saharan deposits tells us something haunting. These were not short-range dispersals. For Nile crocodiles to colonize these inland lakes, the waterways must have been both continuous and long-lasting. Amphibians, such as frogs, which require fresh water to breed, appear in fossil deposits alongside semi-aquatic mammals like hippopotamus and waterbuck. These are not animals that migrate across desert. These are species that live and die within water's reach. And yet, the most surprising element of this vanished water world is perhaps this. It is not truly gone. Some of it remains beneath the surface. Hydrogeologists studying the Nubian sandstone aquifer system, one of the largest fossil aquifers on Earth, have traced its origins back to the African humid period. This aquifer, which spans parts of Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Chad, is essentially a remnant of this wetter past. Rainfall from 10,000 to 5,000 years ago percolated deep into the sandstone and became trapped as surface aridity returned. Today, that fossil water still flows slowly underground, tens of meters below the surface, but detectable through borehole sampling and isotopic analysis. This means that even now, in the most arid parts of the Sahara, the ghost of its green past is still physically present, locked beneath the feet of those who live there, stored not in lakes, but in the rocks themselves. There's a quiet melancholy to this, a reminder that landscapes carry memory not just in shape, but in chemistry, in isotopes, in patterns invisible without the right instruments. The lakes are gone, yes, but their signatures remain, not only in mud, but in the invisible architecture of the land. We can reconstruct these vanished waters with a fair degree of confidence. We can model their volume, their longevity, even their ecological complexity. But the one thing we cannot do is see them. They are gone. Not in a mythological way, but in the literal. There are no ruins, no sunken boats, no songs. Just a question. If lakes that size could vanish completely, what else might we be standing on without knowing? Who were the first humans to walk across this landscape of green savannas, scattered lakes, and quiet riverbanks, where today there is only wind-blown sand? Before there were herds, before there were pots, before anyone buried their dead beneath slabs of stone, there were people here. They left no names, no texts, no oral traditions that we can trace. But they left something else, a snail shell midden, the glint of a barbed bone point, a pattern of fish bones arrayed along an ancient floodplain. They left their habits etched into sediments. The residue of lives lived alongside water in a place we have come to forget was once wet. Between 11,000 and 8,000 years before the present day, long before the desert returned to claim the Sahara, humans lived among its lakes and rivers as foragers and fishers. These were not herders, not yet. They were people who came seasonally, perhaps cyclically, following rain patterns, watching floodwaters rise and recede. They knew how to read the land without controlling it. And what they left behind, fragile as it may be, gives us a rare glimpse into that time when the world was adjusting to a new rhythm. The African humid period was in full bloom, and the Sahara had become briefly, unexpectedly, alive. Let's start by zooming far out, high above the landscape, not in time but in space. From this aerial view, many of the now dry basins dotting the modern Sahara align with ancient watercourses, floodplains, and lakes that once pulsed with seasonal monsoons. Some of these basins, like Wadi Tana Zuft or the Edayen of Merzouk, are enormous even now, as barren gravel plains. During this early Holocene chapter, these were wetlands, ideal for fish, mollusks, amphibians, and the humans who followed them. Across regions that today we might not dare cross without several jerry cans of fuel and GPS, there was a patchwork of freshwater oases, forested margins, and vast reed beds buzzing with dragonflies. And somewhere along one of these ephemeral lake shores, a human sat and cracked open the shell of a freshwater snail. The shell was small, perhaps a few centimeters across, but the work added up. In some cases, archaeologists have found piles of these snail shells stretching meters wide, compacted into layers that show people came back to the same spot again and again, for decades, maybe centuries. These middens, human-made piles of discarded organic material, are often the first clue that someone stayed in a place long enough to call it familiar. One of the key techniques that has brought these patterns to light is stratigraphic excavation. That means peeling back the layers of soil, one at a time, like a reverse time machine. At sites like Ouan Afouda and other now isolated hollows in Libya and Niger, each layer contains its own quiet story, a concentration of charred bone here, a scatter of flaked stone tools there. These are not the grand ceremonial monuments of Neolithic societies. They're more like postcards from people who were never trying to be remembered. But they were here, and they were remarkably good at living lightly. The toolkits of these early Holocene Saharans were often simple, but not crude. Tiny microliths, small, finely shaped pieces of stone, were hafted into wooden shafts to create composite tools. There is evidence of fishing technology that included not only spears and points, but possibly traps made from reeds or wood, long since vanished, but inferred from the behavior of similar groups in more recently documented ethnographies. Barbed bone harpoons, for instance, have been found in what used to be the highlands of the Central Sahara. in areas that once fed seasonal rivers teeming with catfish and tilapia. The barbs were often carved with care, showing not just functionality but perhaps aesthetic choice or group tradition. The animal bones tell another part of the story. Many sites show a preponderance of aquatic species, fish especially. Some bones have burn marks and others show signs of being cut or cracked open for marrow. These aren't the kill sites of big game hunters. They're more like riverside campsites where people stayed for a while, ate well, and moved on. There are even sites where archaeologists have found repeated layers of ash and charcoal with different species of fish represented seasonally, suggesting that people knew when certain fish would spawn, migrate, or become easier to catch. And then there are the hearths. Fireplaces leave behind circular stains, charcoal, and heat-affected stones. Many are small, scattered, informal. These were not great hearths of permanent dwellings, but they indicate community. Someone gathered the wood, someone kept the fire going, someone prepared the fish and cracked open the shells. All of this happened in places we now call wasteland. But one of the most haunting patterns is the absence of structure. There is almost no built architecture from this phase of Green Sahara occupation. That doesn't mean these people lacked skill or complexity. It means they didn't stay put long enough, or didn't need to. In a landscape rich with seasonal abundance, it was easier and safer to move, to follow the rains, to shift between lake and river and grove. It's a way of life that leaves few monuments, but also fewer scars. Some of these early sites are found beneath layers of sediment that only reveal themselves when lakes dry up or dunes shift. Others appear unexpectedly in satellite surveys, their geometry betraying human activity even before the first trowel touches ground. We are only just beginning to map the vastness of what's hidden beneath the Sahara's modern skin. Each shell, midden, and fishbone cluster is a thread in a web that once spanned thousands of kilometers, an invisible map of memory, now resurfacing. This period, roughly from 11,000 to 8,000 years before today, was one of balance. Not yet marked by domesticated animals, permanent structures, or complex societal hierarchies, these people operated in the margins between mobility and settlement, between instinct and innovation. They watched the sky, they read the ground, and they chose the right moment to move. From everything we can gather, they didn't try to control the land, they moved with it. And yet this way of life was never permanent. The lakes would eventually shrink, the rains would eventually falter, and human decisions, where to stay, what to carry, how to survive, would shift in response. Already by the end of this phase, we begin to see signs of change. Tools evolve, camps linger longer. Some groups start to experiment with more than just following herds. They begin to gather them. But that comes later. For now, we pause here, by the lakeshore, among the shells and fish bones and embers, and try to imagine a world where the Sahara was not yet a desert, and human presence was both quiet and everywhere. Because even now, when we fly over the region with satellites, we see the ghost outlines of ancient riverbeds and long-vanished wetlands. The land remembers, even if we've forgotten. The question is whether we can read its memory fast enough before time and heat erase what little remains. And maybe the bigger question is this: if a whole chapter of human history could vanish beneath the sand for 10,000 years, what else have we not yet found? Why did they paint giraffes on stone walls where today only sand and mirage remain? What was the purpose of engraving herds of cattle, flocks of birds, people with bent knees swimming through something now invisible, into the rock faces of a land that now forgets what water felt like? These images are not scattered guesses or isolated outbursts of artistic whim. They are patterns. Thousands of them, spread across the central Sahara, clustered most heavily in mountain massifs and ancient shelters where wind and time conspired to preserve them. Painted not for us, and not to last forever, they whisper instead of a moment when the world was different, and someone thought it was worth remembering. Between around 9,000 and 4,000 years before the present day, across what is now the harshest desert on Earth, people created some of the most compelling, haunting, and scientifically baffling rock art known to archaeology. In places like Tassili Niger in present-day Algeria, Gilf Kabir and Jebel Uwainat in southwestern Egypt, and the Ennedi Plateau in Chad, entire galleries of rock paintings and engravings survive, sometimes in overhangs and caves, other times on open cliffs. What they show is not a desert world, not even close. They show a thriving ecosystem, giraffes with long necks stretching toward vegetation, crocodiles gliding through water, humans leaping, dancing, herding, and, most mysteriously, swimming. The so-called swimmers of Wadi Sura, painted on the rear wall of a cave in Gilf Kabir, show human figures in horizontal pose, arms and legs extended. Some have interpreted them as floating or flying, but most agree they're swimming. The surrounding imagery includes other aquatic elements, hippos, fish, and what might be water plants. This isn't symbolic art meant to depict some mythical heaven. This looks like lived experience. The people who painted this were depicting their world, and their world had water. But where exactly did these people live? How did they reach these remote places? And why paint here? The sites that have preserved these murals are often located in elevated, rugged plateaus. These mountain refuges, such as Tassili Najar, whose name means Plateau of the Rivers, were not as isolated in the early Holocene as they are now. During the African humid period, these highlands received seasonal rains, and runoff supported surrounding grasslands and marshes. Valleys would have held seasonal ponds, and shade-loving plants thrived in canyons. These were not oases in the modern sense, desperate dots of water in a lifeless plain, but integrated parts of a continuous, lush savanna. The rock art gives us more than just a climate snapshot. It shows us behaviors. In the earlier so-called roundhead style, dating roughly to 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, humans are shown with large, circular heads and floating postures. Some appear to wear elaborate costumes or masks. Their limbs taper off, and their actions are hard to interpret. Are they spiritual figures? Shamans? Dancers? The ambiguity is part of what draws attention, even now. There's an otherworldly calm to the roundheads, and they predate the more naturalistic styles that come later. As we move forward in time to around 7,000 to 5,000 years before the present day, a shift occurs. The art becomes more lifelike. Animals are rendered in remarkable detail. Giraffes stand with heads turned, their necks patterned with careful lines. Elephants march in procession. Cattle dominate the imagery, often accompanied by human figures leading or surrounding them. This later style, sometimes called pastoral or bovidian, seems to reflect a new relationship between humans and animals, perhaps the beginnings of domestication, though the paintings alone cannot prove it. One of the remarkable things about this art is its consistency across enormous distances. From the west of Niger to the east of Sudan, similar motifs and painting styles appear, often with local variation but unmistakable common themes. This raises a critical question. Were these isolated groups who coincidentally developed similar symbolic systems, or was there a form of cultural continuity, a network of shared ideas and practices stretching across the Sahara while it was green? We don't know. Not yet. There are no written explanations, no clear stratigraphic sequences that link paintings with radiocarbon-dated hearths or settlements. We rely on relative dating, superimposed images, weathering patterns, comparisons of pigment degradation. In a few rare cases, organic binders in the paint can be dated directly. But most of our timeline comes from context, not certainty. The paintings themselves exist in the strange space between science and silence. The choice of subjects in the art also tells us about the ecosystem. Animals painted in these rock shelters are not desert survivors. They are savanna dwellers. The presence of giraffes, for instance, implies not just grassland but acacia woodlands, trees that need consistent rainfall. Crocodiles and hippos require permanent water or deep seasonal pools. And then there are animals that no longer live anywhere near the region, like ostriches, which once roamed in flocks across the Sahara. Their depiction, along with what seem to be hunting scenes using bows, suggests a detailed knowledge of their behavior. But the most persistent motif, especially in the later phases, is cattle. These animals appear again and again, often with humans nearby. Sometimes the cows are adorned, sometimes not. Their horns are drawn with care. Some researchers have speculated that this reflects not just economic value but symbolic meaning, perhaps social status, ritual significance, or ancestral memory. Whatever the purpose, the art is not random. It is composed, deliberate, and repeated with enough variation to suggest generations of people continued and elaborated the tradition. Despite the apparent clarity of the scenes, interpretation remains difficult. Ethnographic analogies with modern pastoral societies offer some insight, but we must be cautious. Cultural continuity across millennia is rare, and projecting modern meanings onto ancient images risks misunderstanding their original context. Still, The visual vocabulary, the postures, groupings, and repeated symbols suggest these paintings were not casual. They were communicating something, perhaps to other people, perhaps to ancestors, perhaps to the land itself. There's also the question of technique. Many of these artworks were painted using mineral pigments, ochres, hematite, manganese, mixed with binders that have long since evaporated. Brushes may have been made from animal hair, feathers, or plant fibers. Some figures were pecked or engraved into the rock instead, using stone tools. Others were painted high on rock faces, accessible only by climbing, suggesting planning and perhaps a community effort. In some locations, the walls are so densely painted that new figures overlap old ones, forming a palimpsest of image layered on image, as if each generation had to make its own mark. The haunting question that arises from all this is, why did they stop? Around 4,000 years before the present day, the art becomes scarcer. New styles emerge in some areas, but the lush, animated scenes of swimming humans and grazing animals begin to fade. The climate was changing. The monsoon rains had begun to falter, grasslands shrank, water became seasonal, then disappeared, and with it perhaps went the people. Or perhaps they moved, took their memories with them, painted different things in different places. But what remains, etched in ochre and light, is a visual memory of a world now gone. The Sahara as a place not of hardship, but of richness. A land of giraffes, fish, and dance. And here we sit, staring at these walls, thousands of years later, wondering what they meant, who they were for, whether we're reading too much into silence or not enough. The only thing we know for certain is that they were real, that someone stood here, paint in hand, and said, "This matters. This is worth recording." And now we are the ones listening, trying to hear what has long since stopped being said. Can we ever truly know a people who left behind no name, no language we can hear, no words to describe themselves, only the scattered residue of their days and movements pressed gently into the earth? For much of the Green Sahara's early Holocene history, from around 10,000 to 7,000 years before the present, this is what we're left with. A landscape scattered with stone tools, temporary shelters, seasonal hearths, and ancient garbage heaps. No monuments, no writing, no dramatic tombs, just the humble material shadow of human life repeating itself across thousands of square kilometers. And yet, that shadow is enough to know they were here, that they adapted to this land not as guests, but as locals. This was a time before herding, before fields, before any hint of cities. The Sahara was still green then, laced with rivers and dotted with shallow lakes, wrapped in savannas and seasonal wetlands. Across this changing mosaic moved groups of foragers and fishers who did not form a single culture but many, each adapted to the local geography and ecology. Some lived along paleo-channels where seasonal rivers once flowed. Others favored elevated plateaus, perhaps for cooler breezes or defensive views. Still others camped beside the ancient shorelines of now vanished lakes, returning each year as the rains filled the basins and fish migrated inward. These people were not isolated in the sense of being cut off from the world. But they were isolated in another way, a way that matters deeply to archaeologists. They were isolated from names, from cultural labels passed down through history, and because of that, they remain frustratingly anonymous to us. We give them placeholder titles, if we name them at all. Sometimes they are described only by the site where their tools are found, like the people of Adrar Bus, or the foragers of Wadi Tanezuft. Other times we refer to their technology, like bladelet-producing cultures, as if a chipped piece of flint could tell us what they called themselves or how they imagined the sky. But if anonymity is our limitation, diversity is their legacy. Across the early Holocene Sahara, there is no single archaeological signature. The stone tools vary by region. Some favor microliths, tiny geometric pieces fitted into composite tools. Others rely more on larger flakes and bifacial points. There are tanged tools in some regions and not others. Some groups left behind polished axes and grindstones while others did not. These aren't random choices. They reflect cultural preferences, local raw materials, ecological adaptation, and shared learning systems passed down over generations. One of the great debates in Saharan archaeology is whether these early groups should be considered part of larger regional traditions or simply hyper-local adaptations. For example, in the eastern Sahara, particularly in the area now known as the Egyptian Western Desert, archaeologists have identified a pattern of foraging settlements associated with what is sometimes called the Epipaleolithic. These sites often contain large numbers of grinding stones and fish bones, suggesting a broad-spectrum diet focused on seasonal abundance. In contrast, some Western Saharan sites, particularly in Mauritania and Mali, show less aquatic exploitation and more dependence on small game and plant resources. This regional variation hints at a degree of cultural complexity often underestimated when we talk about so-called pre-agricultural societies. These were not simplistic people wandering aimlessly across the savannah. They were sophisticated in ways the archaeological record only hints at. They knew where to find water before the rains came. They returned to the same places year after year, possibly marking routes with stone alignments or memory cues. They adjusted their technologies not just to survive, but to thrive. The tools they carried, the shelters they built, even the bones they left behind, show seasonal planning, group cooperation, and ecological knowledge passed through many human generations. Even in regions where preservation is poor, patterns begin to emerge. In some lakebed contexts, archaeologists have found middens filled with freshwater snail shells, mounds of discarded remains built up over centuries. These are not glamorous finds. They are not the kind of thing that ends up in a museum window. But they are powerful. They tell us that people came back again and again when the snails were plentiful, that they knew the cycles of the lake, that they could time their arrival to a world that pulsed with seasonal abundance. It is knowledge like this, quiet, cumulative, embodied, that forms the backbone of deep human history. Another line of evidence comes from settlement pattern studies. When we map the locations of early Holocene sites across the Central Sahara, certain trends appear. Clusters of sites appear near paleo channels, confirming a dependence on seasonal water flow. There is also evidence of vertical movement, groups using highland zones in the wet season, then moving down to lower basins as the dry season progressed. This kind of transhumance, long before the domestication of animals, shows a landscape intimately known and rhythmically used. But one of the most haunting things about these early cultures is how much of their material life has vanished. Organic remains are rarely preserved. Wood, fiber, hides, and plant material, everything that might have given us a fuller picture, has long since disappeared in the dry churn of Saharan wind. What we're left with are stones, and a few bones. It is an archive written mostly in flint, and yet, those stones speak. They show regional styles, signs of resharpening, use-wear patterns that reveal what they were cutting, scraping, or piercing. Some sites show on-site production, with cores and debitage scattered across a small area. Others show curated tools brought from elsewhere, suggesting movement across longer distances. In rare cases, caches of tools have been found deliberately buried, as if stored for future return. These are not acts of chance. They are acts of memory. Someone intended to come back. But where did they go? How did their cultures change as the Sahara began to dry once more? These questions will be taken up in later parts of our story. For now, we must sit with what remains: stone flakes scattered across the dust, hearth circles buried under sand, and fish bones that whisper of seasonal rains. We cannot name these people, but we can know them in pieces. We can map their choices. We can trace their lifeways in the shadows they left behind. And this perhaps is enough for now. In the absence of names, there is still science. In the absence of words, there is still pattern. And in the absence of certainty, there is still the humble promise that we will keep digging, keep asking, and keep listening for what the past is still trying to tell us, quietly, patiently, from under the sand. What changed when this cattle came? It's one of the quiet revolutions of human history, and one we still do not fully understand. Somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000 years before the present, something shifted across the Green Sahara. The stones underfoot began to tell a different story. Where once there were only wild bones and fishing gear and scattered snail middens, suddenly there were cattle bones. And not the kind that belonged to any wild species native to the Sahara. These bones were from domesticated animals, carefully herded, perhaps even selectively bred. And just like that, the rhythm of life across North Africa began to transform. But what came first, the cattle or the culture? There is no single moment when domesticated cattle arrived in the Sahara. Instead, the evidence is regional, fragmentary, and stubbornly ambiguous. Some of the earliest known indicators come from the Central Sahara, especially around what is now southwestern Libya, Niger, and parts of Algeria. Excavated sites from this period show assemblages with clear signs of bovine remains, mandibles, long bones, and teeth, mixed in with tools, hearths, and ceramics. But these aren't just any cattle. They are domesticated Bos taurus, the same species used in Neolithic herding across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. And that simple fact raises an even deeper question. How did domesticated cattle, likely first tamed somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, make their way into the heart of the Sahara? Did the people who lived here invent cattle herding on their own? Or did the idea, and the animals, arrive through a slow ripple of contact and exchange? It's tempting to think in grand migrations, a wave of herders sweeping in from the east, bringing animals, pottery, and a whole new way of life. But the archaeological record resists that simplicity. Instead, what we see is a patchwork. In some regions, foragers and fishers continue their lifeways for centuries, even as cattle begin to appear in the record. In other areas, we see a rapid uptick in animal remains, alongside new toolkits and ceramic styles. There is no one pattern, just gradual shifts, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, unfolding across a vast and changing landscape. Take, for example, the bone evidence. In early Holocene sites where cattle appear, the morphology of the bones often reveals signs of domestication. Wild aurochs, the large ancestors of modern cattle, had distinctive features: large body size, heavy limb bones, and prominent horn cores. In contrast, the bones found at Green Sahara sites tend to be smaller, with more graceful features and less variability, a hallmark of domesticated breeding. Some show signs of butchery and controlled slaughter, suggesting that these animals were not simply hunted, but managed. This alone does not tell us whether the people themselves changed. That question depends on the rest of the material culture. Did the arrival of cattle coincide with new ceramics, new stone tools, different settlement patterns? In many cases, the answer is yes. Some sites from this period show a clear shift toward more permanent or semi-permanent settlement. Grinding stones become more common. Ceramics begin to appear in larger numbers, often decorated, sometimes burnished, suggesting not just function but style. This hints at a deeper change in how these groups saw themselves. A society that stays longer in one place, that raises animals and stores food, may begin to think differently about time, territory, and belonging. But again, the pattern is not uniform. In some areas, domesticated cattle appear without significant change in the surrounding culture. The same lithic traditions continue, the same seasonal movements. In others, the arrival of cattle marks a broader package of changes, which raises an even more difficult question. Did the idea of cattle herding spread faster than the herders themselves? This is where the concept of cultural diffusion becomes useful. It's possible that local foragers in the Sahara encountered domesticated animals, or the people who managed them, and adopted the practice without large-scale migration. In this model, ideas and techniques move faster than people. A group of fishers or snail gatherers might learn how to manage cattle from neighbors or occasional visitors. They could then integrate these animals into their own lifeways, selectively adjusting their diets, mobility, and social structures. Over time, this could create what we now call pastoralism, a way of life centered not on hunting or gathering, but on the care and movement of domestic animals. Supporting this idea is the fact that early Saharan pastoralism looks quite different from settled Neolithic farming in the Levant or Europe. There is no evidence for enclosed fields, permanent barns, or large-scale storage. Instead, early pastoralists in the Sahara appear to have remained mobile, moving with their herds across grasslands and seasonal water sources. Their tools are lightweight, portable. Their ceramics are often small, suited to transport. This was not the village-based agriculture of later times. It was something else, a kind of mobile pastoralism deeply adapted to the environmental rhythms of the Sahara. And it is precisely this mobility that makes the archaeological record so sparse. Mobile groups leave lighter traces, hearths instead of houses, refuse scatters instead of middens. It takes a great deal of inference to reconstruct their movements. But one thing becomes clear. These early herders knew their landscape intimately. They moved with the rains, followed grass cycles, and likely returned to the same places year after year. Their knowledge was ecological, generational, and deeply embedded in the land. Another piece of the puzzle is ceramic technology. In many parts of the Sahara during this period, we begin to see decorated pottery, incised, stamped, sometimes grooved in regular patterns. These ceramics vary by region but often accompany early pastoralist sites. Whether they spread with people or ideas remains debated, but they mark a material shift, the kind of durable, visible change that archaeologists can track across time. Some researchers believe the ceramic styles themselves help map interaction networks, showing where ideas moved, even when people did not. There is also the matter of water. Early pastoralists needed access to reliable seasonal water sources, not just for themselves but for their animals. This likely shaped their migration routes and social organization. Some groups may have negotiated access to key water points, others may have clashed. Still others may have developed seasonal circuits, a kind of ecological choreography passed down through generations. But the most haunting part of this transition is how much we still do not know. Did herding bring new social structures, new spiritual ideas, new conflicts? The archaeological record hints but does not confirm. We have no writing, no oral history, just the scattered bones of cattle and the tools of people who cared for them. And so we are left with the question we began with. Did the people change, or just their animals? The answer is, perhaps, both. Domesticated cattle brought new possibilities, new ways to move, to feed, to think about time and space. But the people who adopted them were not blank slates. They brought their own traditions, knowledge, and histories. The result was not a replacement, but a blending, a new mode of life that would shape Saharan history for millennia. We will follow that thread in the parts to come. For now, the only certainty is this: the Green Sahara was never static. It was a place of deep human experimentation, ecological, technological, and social. The cattle came north, and with them, slowly, the desert began to remember new footsteps. How do you stay buried for 7,000 years in a land that leaves no trace of yesterday's rain? That is the mystery at the heart of a remote sandstone alcove in what is now southwestern Libya. The Takarkori rock shelter, hidden among the barren gravel plains and wind-sculpted hills of the Caucasus Mountains, would seem, at first glance, an unlikely place for preservation. This is one of the driest regions on Earth. Temperatures soar. Organic material vanishes. Yet here, in the layered silence of a shallow rock shelter, the desert forgot to erase. And because it forgot, we remember. Between the years 7,000 and 4,600 before the present, Takarkori was not dry. It was part of a green and living Sahara. The region had lakes and grasslands, seasonal rivers and animal herds, both wild and domestic. And people were there too, adapting, moving, building ways of life shaped by water that would not last. Over time, they returned to this shelter again and again, leaving behind traces so subtle they would be easy to miss: ash pits, pottery fragments, fish bones, tiny ornaments, and eventually, the careful placement of their dead. Excavated in the early 21st century by a team led by Savino di Lernia from Sapienza University of Rome, the Takarkori site is now one of the most scientifically significant windows into the Green Sahara period. But it didn't begin with grandeur. At first, it was just another weathered overhang in an unforgiving land. Then came the stratigraphy, layer upon layer of human activity, sealed by time and climate. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of continuous, if seasonal, human presence across thousands of years. The earliest deposits, dating back nearly 10,000 years, belonged to groups still living by fishing and foraging. Above that, newer layers reflected gradual changes: the presence of domesticated cattle, shifts in tool types, and pottery forms suggesting increasing cultural complexity. But what made Takarkori unforgettable was a burial, or rather, several burials, found deep within the shelter. Among them, 2 bodies were unlike any others. They had not been buried in elaborate tombs or stone-lined pits. There were no inscriptions, no markers, just the soft grace of desert silence. And yet their bodies had remained. Skin, muscle, and even fragments of internal tissue preserved in a kind of accidental mummification. No resins, no wrapping, just the perfect confluence of shelter, dryness, and time. These were natural mummies, perhaps the oldest of their kind found in the central Sahara. One was a woman, the other a young girl. They had lain undisturbed for over 7,000 years. To find such preservation here is a scientific gift bordering on the improbable. Most organic remains in arid regions are quickly lost to heat, erosion, and scavengers. But the rock shelter's unique microclimate, shaded, elevated, and protected from wind and rain, had sealed them in. Around them, the sand had hardened, the bones curled slightly, as if in rest. Nothing about it seemed ceremonial at first glance, but the positioning was deliberate. This was not accidental. They had been placed. Around these individuals, archaeologists uncovered more signs of human activity. Bones of fish, birds, and bovids. Fragments of decorated pottery, often handmade, with impressed patterns and burnished surfaces. Grinding stones. Small lithic tools. The story they told was not one of monumental civilization, but of a community deeply attuned to their landscape. These were not builders of pyramids or cities. They were something quieter. Herders, gatherers, and fishers, living at the intersection of old lifeways and new possibilities. As more layers were studied, something else emerged: the seasonal rhythm of occupation. Takarkori appears to have been a seasonal site, perhaps a wet season camp, returned to annually. This makes sense. Early pastoralists followed their animals, and their animals followed water. The surrounding region at the time would have offered freshwater lakes and rich grasslands. Excavated sediments show signs of aquatic species, tilapia, catfish, even turtles, indicating that lakes nearby were not ephemeral puddles, but long-lasting ecosystems. The site itself yielded over 70 species of fauna. This was not a desert, it was a savanna. What makes Takarkori so unique is not just what was preserved, but what it suggests. These people were in transition, from foraging to herding, from mobility to semi-sedentism, from purely wild landscapes to managed environments. They still hunted, still fished. But the presence of cattle bones, consistent in size and morphology with domesticated stock, marks a shift. Some had learned to shape animal behavior to their advantage, and this required knowledge of grazing patterns, of water access, of breeding. It also required memory, the kind that lives in a community, not in a text. The shelter's deposits also tell us about the changing climate. Around 6,000 years ago, layers begin to thin. Faunal diversity drops. Signs of occupation become more intermittent. Something was shifting in the sky. Paleoclimate data from sediment cores across the region show a broader trend. The African humid period was ending. Rainfall patterns began to retreat southward. The monsoon weakened. Grasslands turned to scrub. The lakes dried. Slowly the land was reclaiming its silence. And yet, people returned. Even as the environment grew harsher, they came back to Takarkori, perhaps out of tradition, perhaps because the shelter still offered refuge, perhaps because the past lingered there in ways they could not name. Later layers show changes in pottery, new forms, new decoration, as well as shifts in diet. Hunted species became more dominant again. Fish became rare. The transition back toward aridity was not sudden, it was incremental. But it was felt. The significance of the Takarkori burials, then, is not only in their preservation, it is in their timing. These are not the dead of a single moment. They span generations, across a landscape in flux. Their presence tells us that even as climate changed, even as water disappeared and the lakes turned to memory, people remained. They adapted. They moved differently. But they remembered where to return. There are other Green Sahara sites, hundreds of them. But few offer this depth of layered human presence across such a long window of time with such remarkable preservation. Takarkori is not a monument, it is a whisper. And like most whispers, it requires careful listening. What we still do not know outweighs what we do. We don't know the names of these people. We don't know their language, their stories, or how they saw the world. We only know that they lived, and that in one rare moment, the desert chose not to erase them. And perhaps that's enough to begin, because in the next part of the story, the science will shift again. What was once only bones and pottery will become strands of ancient DNA. And from that invisible code, we will begin to glimpse something even stranger, a lineage that no longer exists in full, yet still lives in traces among us. But we are not there yet. Here, in the shadowed hush of an ancient rock shelter, in a land where every wind tries to scatter the past, one small community has been remembered. Not because they were great, not because they built anything that lasted, but because they buried their dead with care, and time, for once, stood still. Why is this ancient African DNA more similar to early Europeans than to other Africans alive at the same time? It is the kind of question that sounds like a mistake, like someone swapped labels or ran the code through the wrong algorithm. But no, the genome was real, the context was solid, and the sand had done something remarkable. It had preserved for over 7,000 years a genetic memory that should not have existed, but somehow did. The Takarkori site in southwestern Libya had already offered a quiet kind of astonishment. A naturally mummified woman and girl, placed gently beneath a rock shelter that had once overlooked a green and living savannah, a site that bore the marks of early herding, seasonal occupation, and subtle cultural shifts in pottery and toolkits. But what lay inside the bones of those mummies was more surprising than any artifact. In the year 2025, a research team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology extracted and sequenced DNA from the preserved tissue. What they found did not match any known population of ancient or modern Africa. Instead, it matched something much older, something deeper. A lineage that split from sub-Saharan African groups not recently, but around 50,000 years ago, the same time modern humans were first leaving Africa entirely. The majority of this ancient genome, nearly 93%, belonged to a branch that had once moved north, then stayed put. Not into Europe or the Levant, not across into Asia, but in North Africa itself. And for thousands of years, it remained there, genetically isolated, drifting on its own. Long before any desert existed, before the lakes dried or the dunes rolled in, this population had diverged and stayed separate. They were not the ancestors of modern West Africans. They were not the ancestors of modern East Africans. They were something else, and their DNA had been buried and forgotten in a shelter that should not have remembered them. It is tempting, as humans, to look for categories, to say, well, if they are not this, then they must be that. But ancient DNA resists those labels. It shows us patterns, not tribes. It reveals branches, not boundaries. And the Takarkori lineage is one of those strange, lonely branches. Their genome bore almost no trace of the admixture we see in later North African populations. No sign of the sweeping genetic currents that later pulled in influence from the Near East, or across the Sahara, or down the Nile. These were people on the edge of a continent, and yet, somehow, they were not swept along. They held. The team compared the Takarkori genome to over 800 modern individuals from across Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. They also used reference panels of ancient genomes from the Levant, Europe, and earlier African foragers. What emerged was a genetic fingerprint unlike any previously recorded. It did not match the sub-Saharan lineages that dominate much of the continent today. Instead, it clustered closer to early out-of-Africa lineages, the kind that had spread into the Fertile Crescent, or perhaps even contributed to early Anatolian populations. And yet these were not migrants. These people had not crossed back. The genetic data was clear. This was continuity, not intrusion. So how could such a population have remained so isolated, so genetically stable, in a region that would later become a corridor of contact? The answer lies in the strange ecology of the Green Sahara. During the African humid period, the Sahara was not a continuous grassland. It was a patchwork. Lakes and river systems flourished, but they did not always connect. Microclimates created zones of habitation separated by hundreds of kilometers of marginal land. And even in this wetter era, long-distance contact was not guaranteed. A group living in one basin may have had little or no contact with another for generations, especially if they were mobile, seasonal, or small in number. In that context, genetic isolation is not so strange. It is simply what happens when people stay put, or stay within a looped territory, for long enough. Over time, the DNA in their descendants becomes a time capsule. It preserves not only their own story, but the story of where they came from. And in the case of Takarkori, that origin appears to trace back to a very old fork in the human tree. There were other surprises. The Takarkori genomes contained Neanderthal ancestry, which, like all non-African humans, had to come from interbreeding that happened somewhere outside Africa, likely in the Near East or southern Europe. But the amount of Neanderthal DNA was extremely low, about 10 times less than what is found in modern Eurasians, and still slightly more than in modern sub-Saharan Africans, who largely lack Neanderthal admixture. This suggests that at some point, a population carrying a very small trace of Neanderthal ancestry returned into Africa, or never fully left, and then stayed isolated long enough for that signature to remain visible, undiluted by later waves. But there is another possibility, one more subtle and haunting, that this lineage was not a re-entry, that it had always been there, not untouched, but insulated. A branch that split from the rest before the great interbreeding events occurred. A group that left Africa slightly, mingled faintly, then returned or settled along the northern rim, and never crossed back into the Sahara in any significant way. The Neanderthal DNA is a clue, but not a map. It tells us contact happened. It does not say when or how. What it does say, with growing confidence, is that the people of Takarkori were not genetically connected to the sub-Saharan populations that would later dominate Africa. And yet, they were not strangers to the continent. They were deeply African. Their lineage was old, native, rooted, but it was not part of the main highways of human migration that textbooks usually draw. It was a byway, a detour, a lineage that did not conquer or expand, but persisted, quietly. That quiet is now being broken, because the DNA does more than tell us where these people came from. It also hints at who carries fragments of their memory today. Modern North African populations, especially those in Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia, still carry low levels of this ancient signature, not as a dominant component, but as a whisper, a trace. It is not the same lineage. The Takarkori genome is no longer found in unadmixed form. It has been folded into others, diluted over thousands of years of migration, conquest, and change. But it is still there, like a watermark beneath the paper. The implications are unsettling in the best possible way. They suggest that our maps of prehistory are incomplete, that deep within the genetic makeup of modern populations lie fragments of people we didn't even know existed. Not every population leaves a monument. Some only leave a genome, and that is enough. What the Takarkori study also reminds us is that the Sahara, for all its size and myth, is not just a place of erasure, it is a place of retention. Sand can preserve as much as it buries. And when the climate is right, and the bones survive, and the sequencing works, we can catch a glimpse of a world we would otherwise have lost. Of course, there are limits. DNA is not a storybook. It cannot tell us what language these people spoke, what songs they sang, how they named the stars. It cannot show us their laughter or fear. It cannot tell us how they loved or what they believed. For that, we still need the artifacts, the burials, the landscapes. The genome is not the story, it is a thread. But it is a rare one, and we follow it not because it gives us all the answers, but because it gives us a different kind of question. How many other lineages have we forgotten? How many others are waiting, sealed in dust, whispering to be found? And more pressingly, if one of them made it through the sand, what else might still be buried beneath our feet, waiting to change the story again? How did a population seem to leave Africa without ever leaving it? The question cuts across everything we thought we understood about early human movement. Because according to the standard story, 50,000 years ago marks the great branching point, when Homo sapiens stepped beyond their continental cradle, leaving Africa in waves, moving east into Arabia, then further still into Asia and Europe. It is the line drawn in every textbook. Out of Africa, a single species expanding, splitting, adapting. But the ancient genome from Takarkori does not sit comfortably on that map. Instead, it suggests something far stranger, a lineage carrying the hallmarks of the out of Africa event, but one that stayed behind, unmixed, unnamed, unbroken for millennia, and entirely unexpected. To understand how this happened, we have to go back, not just to the Green Sahara, but deeper, to the genetic architecture of humanity itself. Somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years on either end, a small group of humans left Africa, carrying with them a narrow slice of the genetic diversity of the continent. It wasn't the first movement out of Africa, but but it was the one that lasted. Everyone alive today outside of Africa descends from that wave, a population bottleneck that eventually spread across the entire planet. But before that branching occurred, the ancestral African gene pool was more diverse. Different populations existed in East, West, and North Africa, each with subtle genetic variations shaped by ecology and isolation. Some of those populations participated in the Out of Africa event, others did not. One of those lineages appears to have stayed behind, along the North African fringe, long enough to diverge on its own path, and that is the one we find in the Takarkori genome. The genetic evidence suggests that this lineage split from sub-Saharan African populations around the same time as the Out of Africa group, roughly 50,000 years ago. But rather than migrating into Eurasia, it appears to have remained in place, or perhaps migrated just slightly north, then circled back. Either way, it did not follow the main corridors of human expansion. It became its own island, genetically speaking. And over tens of thousands of years, that isolation created a distinct branch on the human family tree. One of the markers that points to this is mitochondrial haplogroup N, one of the two major branches that descend from what geneticists call mitochondrial Eve. That is not a biblical term, but a statistical one. The most recent woman from whom all living humans today inherited their mitochondrial DNA. She lived in Africa roughly 150 to 200,000 years ago. Her descendants split into various lineages, but two of those, M and N, eventually left the continent during the Great Expansion. Today, haplogroup N is found widely across Eurasia, but very rarely within Africa itself. And yet, in the Takarkori individuals, we find ancient variants of haplogroup N. Not a recent introduction, not a trace of back migration, but a deeply rooted form that suggests this lineage had been in North Africa for tens of thousands of years, maintaining its distinct signature. This is not supposed to happen. Haplogroup N is considered a marker of non-African ancestry. It was thought to represent a clean break. One branch went out, the rest stayed in. But Takarkori breaks that model. It suggests that some populations carried this genetic legacy while remaining on African soil the entire time. How could that be? One possibility is that the Out of Africa split wasn't a single clean event. It may have involved multiple groups moving at different times, with overlapping ancestries. Some may have left fully, others may have hovered along the margins, what we might call near Out of Africa. Populations that moved into North Africa, encountered Eurasian genes, perhaps interbred faintly, and then remained isolated for tens of thousands of years, forming a genetic echo that was neither fully African nor fully Eurasian, a ghost population hiding in plain sight. Another clue comes from the autosomal DNA, the parts of the genome inherited from both parents. The Takarkori individuals share affinities with early non-African genomes, including those from the Near East. But crucially, they do not show signs of later admixture with other African populations. They lack the genetic signatures of Bantu expansions, Nilotic movements, or even early Saharan nomads. This is what makes them so unique. They are not a blend, they are a holdover. A lineage that diverged early and remained genetically stable in one of the most ecologically unstable regions on Earth. And perhaps that is why they survived. The Sahara is not a kind place. It changes, it erases, but it also shelters. The ecological niches created during the African humid period may have been small, but they were persistent. And in those patches of green, surrounded by marginal zones and intermittent deserts, genetic drift could work slowly and powerfully. Over thousands of years, even a small population could preserve an ancient lineage, simply by being isolated and consistent. No outside gene flow, no bottlenecks severe enough to collapse the lineage entirely, just continuity. It's a quiet kind of story, not one of conquest or collapse, just a population that stayed. And in staying, they preserved a version of human ancestry that otherwise vanished from the record. They did not build empires, they did not carve monuments, they did not leave a name, but they left a genome, and it has forced us to redraw the map. This doesn't mean they were the only such group. Genetic diversity in ancient Africa was far greater than what we see today. Entire lineages have likely vanished, absorbed into larger populations or erased by environmental change. But the Takarkori genome is proof that at least one of those lineages lasted longer than we thought. It is also a reminder that genetic survival does not require cultural dominance. A group can be small, obscure, and unnamed, and still carry a story worth telling. But here's the haunting part. We almost missed them. Without preservation by mummification, without the accident of sampling that specific shelter, without the development of ancient DNA extraction techniques suited for hot environments, we would have no idea they ever existed. The entire lineage would be invisible. And yet, it is one of the deepest splits in the human family tree. So how many more are there? How many unmixed, unnamed, unbroken populations once lived and died across North Africa, leaving no trace but a whisper in the genomes of those who live there now? If this lineage survived until 7,000 years ago, how late did others persist? Could other regions, untouched by archaeologists, untouched by climate stability, still hold bones with stories no one has asked yet? The answer, as always in science, is that we do not know, and that is what makes it worth looking. We are no longer just searching for cities or tools. We are searching for memory. And sometimes that memory hides in the most unlikely places, in a stretch of rock shelter far from rivers, far from farms, far from everything we thought mattered. But to the genome it did, and that is enough. If the Sahara was once green, filled with rivers, grasslands, and seasonal lakes, why does the genetic record tell us it remained so disconnected? The very idea seems contradictory. When a desert becomes a savanna, one expects it to act as a bridge, not a wall. For nearly 10,000 years, from roughly 14,700 to 5,000 years before the present, this once barren landscape bloomed into one of the largest habitable zones on the continent. It should have brought people together, but something odd happened instead. The populations on either side of the Sahara did not blend. They stayed apart, and in doing so, they have left behind one of the quietest mysteries in human evolution. In a world that was briefly open, why didn't anyone walk through the door? The genome from Tucker Corey told us that a deeply isolated North African population existed in the Central Sahara for thousands of years, carrying genetic signatures that diverged from sub-Saharan populations some 50,000 years ago. But this wasn't just an isolated case. Broader population modeling shows a consistent pattern. During the African humid period, when the Sahara was green and theoretically traversable, gene flow across the desert was still remarkably limited. To understand why, we have to think beyond maps. Human migration is not just about open land. It is about perceived viability. Routes must offer water, shade, food, and predictability. And while the Green Sahara did offer much more than today's desert, it was never uniformly fertile. The greening occurred in patches. Lakes and river systems formed seasonally and unevenly. Some years they would overflow. Other years, they would vanish into dust. What looked like a corridor on a satellite image may have felt more like a tightrope to those walking it. Ecologists refer to this kind of terrain as a mosaic. Not a continuous belt, but a scattered quilt of ecosystems, habitable oases separated by unpredictable barriers. In such a mosaic, populations can thrive locally without ever needing to move far. And when groups do attempt movement, the risks of failure are high. A few dry years in the wrong place could end a lineage. So people stayed where it made sense, and over time those small decisions added up. From a population genetics perspective, this creates what is known as structured isolation. Even in the absence of major physical barriers, no mountains, no glaciers, populations can remain genetically distinct if the ecological pressures discourage movement and mixing. Drift takes over. Over hundreds of generations, small differences become pronounced. Mutations accumulate. Shared ancestry fades into distant background noise. And eventually the two groups might recognize each other only in the genome, long after their voices have gone silent. This isn't just a Saharan story. Similar patterns have been observed across other semi-arid regions with seasonal resources. In parts of Central Asia, the Middle East, and even the Americas, populations living within a few hundred kilometers could remain isolated for thousands of years, simply because the terrain between them wasn't worth the gamble. Movement isn't just about possibility, it's about reward. And if the reward isn't higher than what you already have, there is no migration, just continuity. And so, even in the age of rain, North Africa stayed distinct. The Green Sahara may have looked like a highway to modern eyes, but to ancient populations, it was likely a patchwork of known valleys, familiar lakes, and deeply local strategies. Movement wasn't forbidden, It was just rarely worth the cost. In this context, the lack of admixture begins to make sense. The Takarkori genome doesn't show signs of sub-Saharan ancestry because there was no compelling reason for the two populations to meet. They lived in separate ecological realities, even if they were technically neighbors. There's another layer to this, one that often gets missed when looking only at maps and models: the psychological landscape of movement. For a population to leave its territory, even temporarily, it must have a reason. Food scarcity, conflict, curiosity, or spiritual obligation. But in a lush Sahara, these pressures may have been reduced. When resources are abundant and stable, humans tend to stay put. Stability encourages rootedness. It creates cultural boundaries, territorial norms, language divergence, and over enough time, genetic separation. This doesn't mean there was no contact at all. Archaeological evidence does suggest that ideas moved, even if people did not. Pottery styles, tool types, and domesticated animals appear to have spread across the Green Sahara, likely through chains of indirect exchange. But those exchanges did not leave a mark on the genome. They were cultural, not biological. Information moved faster than genes. And this is another reminder that genetic isolation does not mean total isolation. It just means that, reproductively, the doors remained mostly closed. Another clue comes from looking at genetic diversity within the Takarkori population itself. Despite their long isolation, they do not show the signs of a severe bottleneck. Their genome does not suggest inbreeding or collapse. This implies a stable, sustainable population, one that was large enough to maintain its integrity over thousands of years, but small enough to remain distinct. It's a delicate balance, and it only works in regions where the environment supports consistency. So perhaps the Green Sahara wasn't a highway after all. Perhaps it was a scattered constellation of isolated stars, each glowing brightly on its own, but separated by the darkness of ecological caution. People lived. People thrived. But they did not feel the need to join. What we're left with is a contradiction, a landscape that appears open but behaved like a closed system, a lush corridor that carried culture but not blood. And this should make us careful when drawing maps of the past. Just because a path existed does not mean it was walked. Just because a desert bloomed does not mean it connected. And now, the desert has reclaimed those paths. What was once a savanna is now a silence. But the genome remembers. It tells us that some people stayed apart, that their lineages held fast through floods and droughts and the slow turning of the earth. That in the age of connection, some still chose to remain separate. The haunting question, of course, is how many others were like them. How many populations lived just over the ridge across the dry basin, behind the temporary lake, never mixing, never crossing, just persisting? And how many of those have vanished entirely, their stories lost in the churn of the climate, their genes erased before they could be sequenced? The Sahara, even at its greenest, may have always been a place of separation, a place where the illusion of openness hides the reality of isolation. And in that contradiction lies one of the quietest truths in human history. Sometimes, the most profound differences arise not from conflict or conquest, but from simply staying where you are. Somewhere in the dry northeast corner of Morocco, beneath the coarse limestone layers of Tafaralt Cave, lie the scattered bones of a people we barely remember. They lived during the Ice Age, long before the Sahara turned green. They hunted gazelle, they buried their dead, and then they vanished, or so it seemed. But DNA has a longer memory than stone tools or sun-bleached skeletons. And in recent years, that memory has begun to whisper. The whispers are strange. They tell us this group, known in the archaeological shorthand as Ibero-Mauritians, carried something unexpected in their blood, a trace of the Near East, a ghost from across the sea. And now the question is not just where they went, but how they ever got there to begin with. The Ibero-Maurusian culture first appeared around 22,000 years ago, but it is their later phase, between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, that leaves the clearest record. They made microliths, sharp, geometric flakes of flint, likely used for arrows or spears. They foraged a wide diet, shellfish, nuts, and small game. They lived along the Mediterranean coast in open shelters and caves, often returning to the same sites for generations. And at Tafaralt, they left behind something even rarer, carefully buried human remains. The burials at Tafaralt are among the oldest known in North Africa. Bodies were interred with care, some with red ochre, others with animal bones or tools nearby. The site itself, also known as Grotte des Pigeons, contains more than 40 individuals, some in tightly clustered graves. For years, archaeologists debated who these people were. Their tools didn't match earlier African traditions. Their burial practices hinted at deeper symbolic thought. And then, geneticists finally managed to sequence some of their DNA. That's when the story shifted. The genomes revealed a surprising mix. Roughly 60% of their ancestry was similar to populations from the ancient Near East, what would today be called Levantine. The other 40% resembled older North African components. This blend was unexpected. There was no clear evidence of large-scale migration from the east at the time. The Mediterranean Sea was still a barrier. And yet, here was a signature, a deep genetic fingerprint, that tied Ice Age Moroccans to people thousands of kilometers away. The simplest explanation is not always the right one. But in this case, the parsimonious model suggests some form of population movement or contact between the Levant and North Africa, occurring long before the Green Sahara opened up, possibly during brief climatic windows when the Mediterranean became more traversable, or perhaps through a series of slow migrations across the Sinai and Nile corridor. We don't know exactly how the connection formed, but it left a mark that persisted, at least for a while. What's notable is that this Levantine ancestry is not a small trace. It dominates the genome, which means it either arrived in a large pulse or spread through sustained mixing over multiple generations. Either way, it reshaped the local gene pool. And then something else happened. That gene pool, already mixed, seems to have faded. Because when we look at later Neolithic and Holocene genomes from the Sahara, we don't see a clear continuity with the Ibero-Maurusians. They don't show up prominently in later groups. It's as if they arrived, blended, and then dissolved. So what happened to them? One possibility is that the shift to a greener Sahara altered population centers. As rainfall patterns moved southward, so did viable ecosystems. The Taforalt region may have become less favorable for sustained occupation. New groups from the interior, perhaps those connected to early herding or different forager lineages, could have replaced or absorbed the descendants of the Ibero-Maurusians. Cultural turnover, combined with environmental shifts, often leaves little trace. Another possibility is statistical, that we simply haven't found enough genomes yet. Ancient DNA work in North Africa remains limited, especially from intermediate time periods. There may be other individuals, other populations, carrying traces of Taforalt ancestry, waiting quietly beneath the ground. We just haven't listened in the right places. But here's the haunting part. The Ibero-Maurusians are not a marginal footnote in human history. They are one of the oldest populations on the continent with clear genetic data. They represent a unique blend of African and Near Eastern ancestry, present thousands of years before the supposed Neolithic revolution reached North Africa. Their burials are among the earliest in the region. Their tools, though modest, show complex planning and standardization. And yet, they are still treated as transitional, as a people between stories, between epochs, neither Paleolithic nor Neolithic. Just Ice Age ghosts with unfamiliar genomes. In a sense, that's the fate of many groups in human prehistory. They left no writing, no lasting monuments, just teeth, flints, and fragments of bone. But the Ibero-Maurusians left something else, a molecular echo. And that echo tells us the past was never simple. It was never a clean progression from forager to farmer, from isolation to connection. It was messy. It was recursive. Populations moved, mixed, and vanished. Sometimes they returned, sometimes they didn't. The irony, of course, is that we name them Ibero-Maurusians as if we understand them, a label derived from tool typologies and vague geographic associations. But we have no idea what they called themselves, or whether they thought of themselves as part of a group at all. Culture is slippery, genes are even more so. What we do know is this. By 11,000 years ago, the burials at Taforalt stopped. The cave may have remained in use, but its role changed. Later occupations show different toolkits, different dietary patterns. The people had changed, and the ancient ones, the ones with Near Eastern blood and ochre-stained graves, slipped into obscurity. Their genetic signature did not vanish entirely. Traces of it have been detected in modern North African populations, especially those in the Maghreb. But it is diluted, fragmented, woven into a broader tapestry of migrations and expansions that came later. Today, No one carries the Ibero-Maurusian genome in its original form. The lineage has been absorbed, its uniqueness eroded by time, climate, and convergence. And so we return to the cave. Taforalt, quiet now except for the wind, the same limestone walls, the same rocky floor. Somewhere beneath it, the DNA still lingers. The story is still being told. But like all stories from the Ice Age, it's hard to hear. The volume is low. The words are missing. All we have is the residue, a mixture of ancestries, a set of tools, a few painted bones. But that's enough. It tells us there was a world here, a world of movement, of contact, of burial and remembrance. And even if that world ended, it mattered. It mattered because it was one more layer in the sediment of who we are. So the next time someone asks where we came from, don't forget the cave. Don't forget the ones who foraged on a cold Mediterranean shore, who buried their dead with care, and who carried a lineage that shouldn't have existed, but did, just long enough for us to find it again. What does it mean to be related across 8,000 years of time and more than 2,000 kilometers of land? If there were no phones, no writing, no roads, no names, if even the trees and rivers had changed, would you still call someone family? This is not a philosophical question, it's a biological one. Because somewhere in the genetic maps of ancient North Africa, there is a line that runs west, a thread connecting two populations, separated by geography and time, who still belong to the same forgotten lineage. One lived in the caves of northeastern Morocco during the final millennia of the Ice Age. The other was buried naturally in the sands of southern Libya, more than 8,000 years later. And when their DNA was finally compared, it told a story no one expected. That somehow, across centuries of droughts, floods, migrations, and cultural turnover, something had held on. A fragment of ancestry, a signal, a continuity that science hadn't seen, until it looked. Let's be clear about what we're comparing. On one end, we have the Ibero-Maurusians of Taforalt, foragers who lived between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, eating snails and wild plants along the chilly coasts of what is now Morocco. On the other, we have the herders of Takarkori in southern Libya, who buried their dead between 7,000 and 4,600 years ago in the rocky shelters of the central Sahara. These groups never met. They spoke no common language. Their toolkits were different. Their environments were radically transformed. The Sahara that had once separated them had turned green, then dry, then green again. And yet, their DNA links them. What the recent analyses show, particularly from the Takarkori individuals sequenced in 2025, is a pattern of continuity that breaks expectations. While earlier assumptions imagined the Green Sahara as a wide, open corridor that invited sweeping migrations from sub-Saharan Africa, the genetics suggest something else. The people at Takarkori share a closer affinity with the Ibero-Maurusians of Taforalt than with any group to their south or southeast. Their genomes point not to mixture with tropical populations, but to a deep-rooted North African heritage, one that may have branched off early, remained isolated, and maintained itself for thousands of years across the northern third of the continent. This is unusual. Most ancient populations show signs of constant admixture, especially in zones of ecological transition like the Sahara. But here the genetic distances seem smaller between two distant time points than between any of them and the rest of Africa. That means the lineage was not just persistent, it was dominant across space and time, and resistant to replacement. There are two ways to interpret this. One is demographic. It's possible that once the Ibero-Maurusians established themselves in the Maghreb, their descendants slowly spread eastward, eventually populating regions of the central Sahara during the early Holocene. In this model, the Takarkori population would be an eastern offshoot of the original western population, a kind of delayed echo, still carrying the core of the ancestral genome, but shaped by local conditions. The other interpretation is ecological and isolating. The Sahara, even when green, is not uniformly habitable. It was broken into patches of lakes, rivers, and savannas, separated by rocky or sandy barriers. In this model, the ancestral population of North Africa splintered into semi-isolated groups, who each preserved different portions of the original gene pool. Takarkori and Taforalt might represent two ends of the same fragmented system, more connected to each other than to the outside, simply because of how the landscape forced people to stay put. Neither model excludes the other. Both rely on a fundamental insight. that for thousands of years, North Africa was not a genetic thoroughfare. It was a cradle. And like most cradles, it kept what was placed inside safe, at least for a while. What makes this connection between Libya and Morocco more powerful is that it appears against a backdrop of turnover elsewhere. Across much of the Holocene, we see massive shifts in the genetic profiles of people from the Levant, the Nile Valley, and sub-Saharan regions. New ancestries appear and disappear, technologies spread, languages shift. But this particular line, this North African signature, remains surprisingly intact, unmixed, unnamed, and unbroken. Of course, nothing is ever truly untouched. The Takarkori genomes are not perfect copies of Taforalt's. There are small traces of other inputs, possibly from East African or Levantine sources. But they're minor, more like brushstrokes on an older canvas than new paintings entirely. And their presence only strengthens the argument that this was not a story of replacement, but of slow adaptation. So what does it mean to trace a lineage like this? It means we can no longer treat North Africa as a blank transitional zone between the so-called real civilizations of Egypt and the Levant. It means the people living there during the African humid period were not genetic anomalies, but descendants of Ice Age communities who had already survived more climate change than any of us can imagine. It means there was not one origin story for the region, but a layered history of endurance, where culture may have changed, but genes carried memory across impossible distances. And yet, this is not a triumphalist narrative. These lineages are gone now. The specific genome profiles found in Taforalt and Takarkori do not exist in pure form in any modern population. They've been diluted, absorbed, overwritten by later waves. That's what always happens. Time erases, but it also remembers, in code, in bones, in dust. We're left with one of the quietest mysteries in African prehistory. Two groups, divided by deserts and centuries, still hold the same signal. They never knew each other, never traded or spoke. But in the cells of their bones, something old persisted. And perhaps, for a little while, they were part of a continent-long family, one whose name we'll never know, but whose story we're finally beginning to hear. The haunting part? They didn't leave us a map. No painted symbols, no glyphs or markers, just DNA, just the improbable math of inheritance, passed along through generations who never knew they were part of a pattern. But the pattern is there. A line runs west. It fades now in the genomes of the living, but it burns bright for a moment, here in the bones of the forgotten. How do you change everything, without anyone noticing? That is what we're looking at now. A shift so massive it redefined the structure of life in the Sahara, but so subtle that, for a long time, archaeologists weren't sure who, or what, was responsible. Because between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, the people of the Green Sahara began doing something new. They started raising cattle, herding goats, managing food not just by gathering it, but by growing relationships with the animals that provided it. But here's the quiet part. The people themselves didn't change, at least not in the genetic record. The bones stayed local. The genomes stayed familiar. So if the herding revolution wasn't carried in by a wave of new migrants, what exactly happened? This is where the idea of cultural diffusion takes center stage. Not invasion, not conquest, just the slow transmission of knowledge, tool by tool, practice by practice, carried not by armies but by neighbors. And it may be one of the most underappreciated forces in early human history. We tend to expect the big transitions in prehistory, agriculture, metallurgy, cities, to be dramatic, to be loud, cultures swept aside, populations replaced. And in some regions, that's exactly what happened. But in the Central Sahara during the African humid period, the evidence points to something quieter, a pattern in which local foragers and semi-sedentary communities gradually incorporated herding into their lives without being displaced. In short, the idea moved faster than the people. Let's look at the clues. In southern Algeria and southwestern Libya, rock shelters and open-air sites show a clear timeline of material change. Around 8,000 years ago, we start to see bones of domesticated cattle mixed in with wild fauna. Not many, just a few at first, then more. Eventually, herding becomes dominant, but it doesn't happen all at once. The lithic industries, the settlement patterns, and the burial practices remain locally continuous. There's no abrupt disruption in the archaeological record. It's as if the same communities slowly shifted their strategies, blending old ways with new tools. And it's not just the bones. The rock art tells a similar story. Across sites like Tassili Niger, Dabous, and the Mesak Plateau, we see depictions of cattle alongside human figures, not as symbols of exotic power, but as everyday companions. The animals are shown walking, grazing, being tended. This isn't the imagery of conquest. It's the visual language of integration. Of course, there had to be a source for the pastoral knowledge. Domesticated cattle don't appear from nothing. Genetic studies of the animals themselves point to Near Eastern origins for early domestic stock, particularly from the Fertile Crescent. So at some point, these domesticates, or at least the idea of them, made their way across northeastern Africa. But the transmission appears piecemeal. The animals came, but not in great herds. The skills came, but not with mass demographic replacement. The humans who adopted them remained largely of local ancestry. This is supported by the genomic data, particularly from the Takarkori site in Libya and others in the broader Sahara. Across the window from about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, we see minimal signs of foreign admixture. These were not populations overrun by Levantine migrants or East African newcomers. If there was contact, it left little genetic trace. And that's important, because it tells us that people can absorb revolutionary practices while staying genetically stable. It's also worth noting that herding may have appealed specifically because of its flexibility. In the patchwork ecology of the Green Sahara, farming was often impractical, rainfall was unpredictable, soils were thin. But mobile pastoralism worked. Herds could be moved between grazing zones, communities could adapt seasonally, and herding didn't require full sedentarism. It was a new lifeway that slotted cleanly into existing patterns of semi-nomadic life. So the spread of pastoralism was not a single event, but a series of choices made by people who were already navigating the edge of ecological change. As the lakes shrank, as rainfall began to falter, the old ways of foraging became less sustainable. Herding provided a buffer, a means to stay in place even as the land began to shift. And so it was adopted, not because outsiders imposed it, but because locals saw its value. This is a story not of conquest, but of calibration. Of course, diffusion is never completely invisible. Even if the people didn't change, the material culture did. Pottery styles shifted, toolkits evolved, ceramics with distinctive combing or impressing patterns began to appear across distant regions. Some of these motifs may have originated further east, near the Nile or the Horn of Africa. But again, the spread was not one of violent displacement. It was trade, imitation, interaction, a Saharan internet of ideas, slowly downloading new updates across the landscape. There's also a wider implication here, a philosophical one maybe. In human prehistory, we often assume that innovation requires movement, that technology spreads because people move. But sometimes the opposite is true. People stay where they are. And what travels instead is knowledge, language, ideas, a whispered trick for storing milk longer, a borrowed technique for corralling goats, a pottery style seen at a seasonal meeting and replicated back home. That's how change can happen without noise, without war, without drama, just the quiet diffusion of culture. And that matters, because it means the early Saharan herders were not passive recipients of progress. They weren't overwhelmed by outside forces. They were participants, agents, choosing to adapt at their own pace. And in doing so, they preserved something that might have been lost in more turbulent transformations: continuity. The archaeological record supports this. There's no sharp division between pre-herding and herding sites, no evidence of burned layers or abandoned settlements. Instead, we see layers of sediment and artifact that suggest gradual evolution. A fishing camp becomes a seasonal cattle post. A shell midden is repurposed as a livestock corral. Change happens, but at the tempo of life, not conquest. So what should we call this process? It doesn't fit neatly into the boxes of traditional diffusion theory. It's not demic diffusion, where people move. It's not elite dominance, where a small foreign group imposes their system. It's something else. Maybe we need a new term: soft diffusion, adaptive absorption. Or maybe we don't need to name it at all. Maybe we just need to accept that in some corners of prehistory, people changed without losing themselves. And that's a kind of resilience worth remembering. The haunting question is this: if cultural knowledge can move without people, how many other revolutions in history happened the same way? And how many do we miss because we're only looking for the footprints of bodies, not the ripples of ideas? In the end, what spread through the Green Sahara was not an empire, but a strategy. Not a people, but a possibility. And it left behind not ruins, but echoes. In pottery, in paintings, and in the bones of animals who once walked with humans through lands now claimed by sand. There are no Neanderthal bones buried in the Sahara, no flint tools sharpened by squat, barrel-chested humans, no caves smudged with their ochre handprints. And yet, in the silence beneath a Libyan rock shelter, something strange remains, not in the soil, not in the art, but in the blood memory of a woman buried more than 7,000 years ago. She was not a Neanderthal, she had never seen one. And yet, in her genome, there was a whisper, a faint echo, of a species long gone. About 1% of her DNA came from Neanderthals. And that single percentage opens a door to one of the strangest questions in Saharan prehistory. How did a trace of Ice Age Europe end up inside the body of a woman born in the Green Sahara? To answer that, we need to talk about ghosts. Not the kind that haunt burial grounds or flicker through firelight, but the kind that pass through chromosomes. Genetic ghosts, faint residues left behind by species that once touched our lineage and then vanished. The Neanderthals are the most famous of these. Once spread across Europe and parts of Western Asia, they disappeared roughly 40,000 years ago. Or more precisely, they were absorbed. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in enough places that their genes persist. Today, every person outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. A lingering inheritance from a few encounters, tens of thousands of years ago. So how did that inheritance reach the Sahara? Here's where things get complicated. The woman from Takarkori, whose genome was recovered in a groundbreaking study in the year 2025, lived far from the known Neanderthal range. She was born and buried in what is now the Libyan desert, in a region that had become temporarily lush, dotted with seasonal lakes and grassland valleys. Her ancestry, as we saw earlier, was overwhelmingly North African, deeply rooted, genetically isolated, and yet buried within her DNA was a thin thread of Neanderthal ancestry, less than what we find in Europeans, but more than what we usually see in modern West Africans. This isn't just trivia, it's a riddle, because it means that somewhere in her lineage, likely tens of thousands of years before she lived, her ancestors must have come into contact with populations who had already mated with Neanderthals. In other words, there was back migration. At some point, humans who had ventured out of Africa interbred with Neanderthals in Eurasia and then returned south, bringing with them the genetic shadows of another species. But this isn't your classic out-of-Africa model. It's not a story of Homo sapiens sweeping into Europe, meeting Neanderthals, and moving on. It's more of a loop, a smaller, stranger loop, because the genetic evidence suggests that the North African lineage represented by the Takarkori woman didn't simply branch off from sub-Saharan populations. It diverged much earlier, possibly around the same time as the ancestors of non-African populations. It then remained largely isolated, and yet, at some point, a faint trickle of Neanderthal DNA entered the picture. The amount is telling. The Takarkori individuals carry significantly less Neanderthal DNA than any non-African populations today, but they carry more than modern sub-Saharan Africans. This suggests two things. First, that the admixture event likely happened only once, very early on. Second, that no further waves of Neanderthal gene flow reached them. Whatever encounter happened, it was brief, and then it ended. So where did it happen? There are a few possibilities. One is the Levant, the land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. It's a plausible corridor, and we know from other studies that both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens moved through this region in waves over tens of thousands of years. But the Takarkori individuals don't show strong affinity to Levantine populations of later periods. Their lineage is distinct. That suggests that if the Neanderthal DNA came through the Levant, it must have been very early and very limited. Another possibility is North Africa itself. There's a faint chance that Neanderthals once roamed further south than we currently have fossil evidence for, perhaps during cooler climatic windows. But so far we have no archaeological record of Neanderthals that deep into Africa. No bones, no tools. so this remains speculative. A third hypothesis is that the Neanderthal ancestry arrived via an early back migration from a population that had already left Africa, mingled with Neanderthals elsewhere, and then returned along the northern fringe. Not a large-scale movement, not a population replacement, just a thread, a sliver of DNA carried quietly through time, absorbed into the ancestors of the people who would one day live, herd, and die in the Green Sahara. This idea fits with the broader pattern we're seeing in Saharan genetics: high continuity, low admixture, but not total isolation. The Takarkori lineage is remarkably stable, yet not entirely untouched. It's a kind of genetic island that received a single wave and then closed its shores. Why does this matter? Because it complicates our understanding of human movement. It challenges the binary of in Africa and out of Africa. The genetic map is not a clean split. It's more like a web with forgotten threads, dead ends, and ancient returns. And the Neanderthal ancestry in North African genomes is one of those threads, fragile, faint, but undeniable. It also reframes the way we think about connection. We often imagine the Sahara as a barrier, a vast, impassable sea of sand. But during the African humid period, it was anything but. It was a landscape of lakes and savannas, traversable and rich. And yet, even then, the people who lived there remained genetically distinct, which means that when contact happened, and it must have at least once, it didn't lead to assimilation. The Neanderthal trace slipped in, and then nothing else did. From a scientific standpoint, this is a reminder of how little we know about the population structure of early humans. Most ancient DNA samples come from temperate regions, where preservation is easier. Africa, especially the Sahara, is still a genomic blank spot. The fact that we're finding Neanderthal ancestry here at all is astonishing. It opens a new chapter and raises dozens of questions. Was this Neanderthal signal shared across all of early North Africa? Or was it confined to specific groups? Did it come from a single admixture event or multiple trickles? Could there be more surprises waiting in other samples, buried under sand, forgotten in storage rooms, encoded in teeth and bones yet to be sequenced? And then, there's the human side of the story, the poetic one. Because when we speak of a woman buried 7,000 years ago in a place that is now dry and silent, we're not just speaking of a data point, we're speaking of someone whose blood carried a memory of another kind of human, a different species, long gone, whose trace lives on only in chromosomes. She never met a Neanderthal, she never knew they existed, but part of her was theirs, a whisper from a vanished world. That whisper doesn't speak loudly, it doesn't scream for attention, but it tells us something humbling, that even in the most remote corners of prehistory, we are connected. Not always through migration, not always through culture, but through time, through accidents, through old encounters that left no mark in the soil, but stayed in the body. So the next time someone tells you the Sahara was once a passageway, remember this: it wasn't always open. And when it was, it let through only echoes. 1%, maybe less. Just enough to remind us that our story is shared, even with those we lost before we knew they were part of us. It did not end with a bang. There were no walls to fall, no battles to record, no final days of empire carved into stone. Just the air drying out, 1 degree at a time. Just the rains retreating, 1 season too early. The Sahara did not become a desert in a single moment. It collapsed in slow motion over centuries, with no one left to write it down. Between 6,000 and 4,000 years before the present, the Great Greening began to unravel. For thousands of years prior, the African humid period had transformed the continent. Grasslands had rolled across what is now barren sand. Lakes had spilled over into networks of rivers. Elephants, giraffes, crocodiles, and hippos had lived deep in what today seems impossible, the Saharan interior, and people had lived among them, fishing, painting, herding, burying their dead. Then, very slowly, the system began to die. This was not a surprise from the perspective of planetary physics. Earth's orbital cycles, the gentle wobble, tilt, and precession that reshape climate over thousands of years, were always going to turn the Green Sahara brown again. As the northern hemisphere tilted further from the sun during the summer months, the African monsoon began to weaken. Not catastrophically, not even consistently, just enough to let the dryness in, just enough to let the silence return. Paleoclimate records from lake sediments, pollen cores, and ancient shorelines all tell the same story. The lakes shrank, their shorelines pulled inward like lips around a drying well. First seasonally, then permanently. At sites like Lake Mega Chad, once among the largest freshwater bodies in the world, the water receded until only vestiges remained. Around 5,000 years before the present, entire systems of rivers dried up completely. Some turned to dust, some to fossil valleys. The Nile itself, which had once been swollen by tributaries from now vanished Saharan catchments, became more singular, more isolated. It was not that a river stopped flowing. It was that the continent exhaled and did not inhale again. The animals, too, began to vanish. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but the trend was clear. The massive wetland fauna that had once thrived in Central Sahara began to disappear from the record. Hippopotamus bones become scarce. Giraffe imagery, so dominant in the rock art of earlier centuries, fades. Even fish remains, once abundant at lakeside sites, decline in number and size. This was not just a change in species, it was a change in story. The people followed the water, or tried to. Some moved seasonally, chasing the last of the rain-fed valleys. Some may have stayed longer than others, waiting for the skies to change again. But year after year, the grass did not return. The desert crept forward in bands. At some sites, the abandonment is abrupt. Hearths are left half-buried. Fishing gear is found where no water ever came back. At others, the fade-out is gentler. A thinning of material, a gap in stratigraphy, a slow quieting of the human mark. There was no single tipping point, no moment when someone stood up and said, "It is over." The Holocene climatic optimum gave way to what we now call the mid-Holocene transition, a long decline, driven not by human error or overuse, but by planetary rhythm. The sky changed, and with it, the Earth. From the outside, this might sound almost peaceful, a slow shift, a graceful exit. But for the people living it, the change would have been brutal. Water sources became unreliable. Pasture land for cattle shrank. The rhythms that had supported life, fish spawning in lake inlets, grazing animals following predictable tracks, broke down. With less vegetation came less game. With less game came hunger. With hunger came movement. This was not a cultural collapse in the dramatic sense. It was more like being erased by the climate itself. Archaeologists trace this transition through increasingly sparse site distributions. The once dense clustering of settlements across the Central Sahara begins to fragment. Regions that were once home to hundreds of seasonal camps become empty. In satellite imagery today, you can still see the ancient lake beds, bright outlines in the dust, like ghosts of water. And near their shores, you sometimes find the remnants of human life. Grinding stones, charcoal fragments, a piece of worked bone, and then nothing. What makes this all the more haunting is the absence of conflict. There are no mass graves, no weapons scattered across the sands, no walls, no fortifications. This was not a war. This was a withdrawal, a long, reluctant retreat into margins of habitability. Some groups likely turned south toward the Sahel. Others may have moved into the Nile Valley or into mountain oases that held water just a little longer. But in the Sahara itself, the story ends not with fire, but with wind. Paleoclimatic reconstructions show that the monsoon decline was not smooth. There were fits and starts, temporary reversals, years of better rainfall that might have offered hope. But the overall trend was clear. Between 6,000 and 4,000 years before the present, aridification became irreversible. Dune fields began to form in places where grass had once grown. The desert reasserted itself not as a destroyer, but as a forgetter. This is what makes the end of the Green Sahara so fascinating and so sad. It is not just a case of environmental change, it is a case of memory loss. The lakes disappeared, the animals followed, the people left, and the earth covered it up. It would take millennia before anyone knew what had happened, before radar and satellites and sediment cores revealed the secret landscapes beneath the sand. From a planetary perspective, the Sahara was simply returning to its default state. Dryness is the norm here. The greening was a brief intermission, but from a human perspective, it feels like a closing door, a window of habitability shut tight for thousands of years, a region that had once been full of life, full of children, songs, camps, and herds, turned back into a place of absence. And in that absence, we are left with fragments. Rock art that makes no sense without the animals it depicts. Fishing tools stranded miles from any water. Genetic lineages that tell of peoples who once thrived, then vanished from the land but not from the genome. We have no texts from these cultures, no oral histories, just the record of their ecology, and the silence that followed. This is why the end of the African humid period is so important to study. It is not just a climate event. It is a story of how human lives are shaped, and sometimes erased, by forces they cannot control. It reminds us that civilizations do not always end in violence or folly. Sometimes they end with no one watching. Sometimes the rain just stops falling. What makes it stranger still is that this event happened not long ago. In geological terms, the desertification of the Sahara is recent. As little as 4,000 years ago, there were still isolated wetlands in some parts of the interior. Some groups may have clung to them, preserving fragments of a way of life already on the brink. But eventually, even those disappeared. The desert won. Today, when we look at the Sahara, we don't see a place that used to be green. We see a place that always was sand. But this is a trick of the present. The past, as recorded by pollen and dust and bones, tells a different story. And the people who lived that story, who saw the first signs of the lakes failing and knew what it meant, are gone. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what words they used for drought or for sorrow. All we know is that they left, and the sand took their place. So what happens when a civilization is erased by the sky itself? Maybe nothing. Maybe no one notices. Until, thousands of years later, we dig through the dust, pull up a shell midden, and start to remember. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but enough to know that once, for a brief and brilliant moment, the Sahara was alive, and then it wasn't. There are migrations that leave roads behind. Walls, pottery, bones, monuments, you can trace them like a path through snow. And then there are the other kind. Movements that happen quietly, over generations. Not a march, but a slow dispersion. No war, no collapse, no king to chronicle it. Just people following the water 1 year further than the year before. The exodus from the Green Sahara was the second kind. Between 4,000 and 2,000 years before the present, the desert was reclaiming the interior. Lakes were gone or fading. Grasslands had thinned to brittle scrub. The rock art stopped showing elephants and began showing only goats. And then it stopped altogether. But the people did not vanish. They moved. And the problem is, they did it with such softness, we almost missed it entirely. What we think happened, and here think is doing a lot of scientific heavy lifting, is that the Green Sahara did not empty all at once. Instead, as rain belts withdrew, groups moved outward in every direction. Some likely turned north, toward the Maghreb coast. Others followed ancient riverbeds eastward, eventually spilling into the Nile Valley. Many likely turned south, into what is now the Sahel, the semi-arid grassland that still buffers the desert. And some may have stayed longer than expected, hanging on in highland oases like the Tibesti or the Air Mountains, clinging to the last pockets of habitability. But wherever they went, they left little behind. This is one of the great frustrations of Holocene archaeology. We can reconstruct dramatic climate curves and even detect microstratigraphy from pollen cores. But the human story remains full of blanks. The rock art tells us people were there. The sediment cores tell us the lakes dried. And then we are left to guess what paths they took into the future. Still, some trails shimmer faintly. In the Nile Valley, beginning around 4,000 years before the present, we see a thickening of settlement along the riverbanks. This was not just a fluke of agriculture. The Nile was becoming a refuge, a reliable artery of water in an increasingly dry world. The earliest complex societies in Egypt emerged in this period, and while their roots likely run deep in the valley itself, it's hard not to notice the timing. As the Sahara collapsed, the Nile became not just a river, but a destination. Further west, along the Maghreb coast, we see another pattern. Sites become more frequent. Material culture becomes more diverse, and the ecological niches people are exploiting expand. Coastal foraging, upland herding, and seasonal movement across semi-arid zones. Here too, it is difficult to prove that these are the same people who once painted giraffes in Tassili or fished the shrinking lakes of the Tenere. But the timing lines up. As the interior emptied, the margins filled. The Sahel, stretching from Mauritania to Sudan, is perhaps the most important and least understood part of this story. This belt of land, dry but not desert, has long acted as a corridor of movement, and after the Green Sahara faded, it seems to have absorbed a tremendous amount of that movement. Archaeological sites show continuity of foraging, followed by the gradual adoption of pastoralism. What's curious is how localized the transitions seem. There is no signature cultural package that arrives all at once. Instead, each region adapts in its own way. It suggests that whoever moved through these areas came not as conquerors or settlers, but as gradual integrators, absorbing and adapting, not replacing. We should pause here to admit something uncomfortable. We do not know who these people were. We do not know what languages they spoke. We do not know their names, their gods, or their stories. This is not a migration like the Indo-Europeans or the Bantu expansions, with linguistic footprints and wide-reaching cultural echoes. This was something quieter, something more like vapor dispersing than a wave breaking, and that makes it hard to trace. But maybe that's the point. Not every human story is loud. Not every movement leaves behind a legacy of empires and alphabets. Some people just leave. They do not leave messages. They do not leave roads. They leave only patterns, shifts in settlement, changes in tool style, faint shadows in the archaeological record. And yet their disappearance from the Sahara reshaped everything. The drying of the interior pushed populations outward, subtly redrawing the demographic map of northern and sub-Saharan Africa. Cultural practices that had once developed in the green heart of the continent began to surface at its edges. Water management, mobile herding, seasonal movement, these were not imported from distant lands, but evolved responses to a world that was vanishing behind them. We also need to be cautious here. It is tempting to speak of migration as a single, sweeping event. But what likely happened was more like a patchwork of responses. Some groups may have migrated hundreds of kilometers. Others may have moved just far enough to find a new spring. Over generations, these movements accumulate. By the time the desert had fully returned, the human map had shifted, not with drama, but with momentum. In the archaeological record, these shifts show up not as trails, but as gaps. Sites vanish in one region and reappear elsewhere. Habitation density changes. The styles of grinding stones and ceramics evolve. Sometimes they resemble what came before. Sometimes they are entirely new. It is in these edges, these transitions, that the human exodus from the Green Sahara lives on. Even now you can stand on the rocky plains of the Central Sahara and find no trace of the people who once lived there. The wind has taken most of it. What remains are fragments, a hearthstone, a fishhook, a smear of pigment on cave wall. But those fragments point outward. They suggest movement. They whisper of people who did not wait to be buried by the desert. They walked away from it. So how do you track a migration that left no footprints? You look not for trails but for absence. You read the silences in the archaeological record. You map the places that filled up just as the others emptied out. And you remember that humans are not always loud. We are not always permanent. Sometimes we disappear so well that it takes satellites and sediment to find out we were ever there. The Green Sahara people may have left no bones, but they did leave echoes. Not in monuments, but in the way cultures shifted just as the rain stopped falling, in the way herding appeared in new zones, in the way oases became lifelines. You might be carrying the desert inside you, not in your skin or your bones, but deeper, in your cells, in the four-letter code that whispers where your ancestors wandered, where they settled, and where they vanished. The Green Sahara may be gone, its lakes are dust, its herders long buried, but its story did not disappear. It went underground, and in some people, it never left. This is not a story about the past, not anymore. It is about what remains, about what survived the collapse of rain belts and the slow retreat of memory. In recent years, genetics has done something archaeology could not. It has traced echoes of the ancient North African lineages, not just to ruins, but to people alive today. And the findings are quietly extraordinary. Let's start with the Berbers, or more precisely, the Amazigh, an indigenous North African population, found from Morocco to Libya and far beyond. For decades, their language and cultural traditions have pointed to long-standing continuity in the region. But it is in their DNA that the full story begins to crystallize. Several large-scale genomic studies over the past decade have shown that Amazigh populations, especially those in the more isolated mountain regions like the Rif and the RS, carry a unique blend of ancestries. And central to that blend is a component that now appears unmistakably ancient. It's not that modern North Africans are direct clones of the Takarkori woman or the Taforalt foragers, but it is becoming clear that the core of those early Holocene genomes did not vanish. In fact, the ancient North African lineage, once thought to be absorbed or erased by later waves of migration, persisted. It remained embedded in the genetic structure of populations that would later be labeled Berber, Libyan, Egyptian, or Sudanese. One of the markers that stands out most is mitochondrial haplogroup U6. This is a maternal lineage that branched off from the broader U family tens of thousands of years ago, and today is most commonly found in North Africa. It likely originated from an early migration back into Africa from the Near East or Eurasia, but once there, it became local, deeply local. When we compare it to ancient remains like those from Taforalt, it is still there. And in some modern Amazigh populations, it persists at significant frequencies. The story of U6 is not a story of replacement, it is a story of survival. There are other signals too, autosomal genetic components that cannot be fully explained by either sub-Saharan or European ancestry. These form what population geneticists sometimes refer to as the North African component. It's a bit of a placeholder, an admission that we see something ancient and regionally specific that doesn't quite match known profiles from elsewhere. And crucially, this component is strongest not in cosmopolitan urban centers, but in rural and highland populations who maintained relative isolation for millennia. In Egypt, the picture becomes more layered. The Nile Valley has long been a corridor of movement, and its population structure today reflects that. But even here, in among the threads of Levantine, sub-Saharan, and Mediterranean admixture, there remains a detectable echo of ancient North African ancestry. Not dominant, not untouched, but present, especially in southern Egypt and parts of the western desert, where the Saharan collapse may have funneled populations in from the west. The desert closed, and the river welcomed. What's humbling is just how little this was understood until recently. For much of the 20th century, the genetic history of North Africa was treated as a kind of derivative zone, shaped by the Arab expansion, by Roman trade, by Carthaginian seafarers, by whoever happened to sweep through next. But now, a different picture is emerging, one in which the foundation was laid not by external empires, but by the people who painted giraffes on the cave walls and buried their dead beneath drying savannas, the people who fished lakes that no longer exist, and herded cattle through grasslands that are now a mirage. In other words, the Sahara did not erase its people, it compressed them, it sent them to the margins, and then those margins became the heartlands of new populations. The genes that stayed behind are not a time capsule, they are a mosaic, layered, altered, but traceable. And as genetic techniques become more sensitive, as more ancient genomes are recovered and compared, we are beginning to map the continuity, not of identity, but of ancestry, of a signal that pulsed through the Holocene and still beats, quietly, in the veins of millions. This has led to a slow but growing reassessment of population models in Africa. Where once North Africa was treated as an extension of Europe or the Middle East, it is now being recognized as a unique genetic zone, one with its own deep time history, one that cannot be reduced to invasion or trade. The Green Sahara, it turns out, was not just a temporary garden, it was a cradle. And even after the cradle dried up, the children carried its legacy forward. Of course, the question remains, what does it mean to carry that legacy? Genetics is not identity. Ancestry is not destiny. Most people with these genetic signals do not know it, and will never need to. But from a scientific perspective, it matters. It tells us that the people who once occupied the interior of Africa during the Holocene were not replaced. They became part of what came after. They left their story not in monuments or texts, but in recombination and statistical haplotypes. It's not quite the epic saga we're used to, but it's real, and it matters. And there is something strangely comforting about that. In a world where so many ancient peoples have truly vanished, where languages and genomes and stories have been wiped clean by time, It is reassuring to know that the Sahara, for all its silence, failed to erase everything. Some part of those vanished ecosystems and unnamed cultures still exists, not in the desert, but in us, or at least in some of us. If you have ancestry from North Africa, especially from regions like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, or Egypt, there is a non-trivial chance that you are carrying pieces of this story. Not whole genomes, not pure lineages, but echoes. And perhaps that is the only kind of inheritance that truly survives climate, conquest, and collapse. So are you carrying the Sahara's lost story inside your cells? Maybe, maybe not, but someone is. And even if we never know their names, even if the rock art fades and the lakes are forgotten, the fact that we can still hear the genetic whisper of the Green Sahara reminds us of something bigger. That memory does not always die with silence. Sometimes it just waits, buried, recombined, and still pulsing beneath the surface. Not all civilizations announce themselves. Some vanish without a name. No scrolls, no temples, no kings carved in stone. Just the slow fade of memory and a silence too complete to break. The Sahara was once full of life, green, inhabited, painted, fished, herded, and then it wasn't. The sand returned, and with it, an emptiness that settled into our textbooks too. And so the question remains, how do we remember a people who didn't write things down? We are biased creatures, especially when it comes to history. We tend to record what is already loud. Kingdoms with armies, cities with taxes, scripts chiseled into permanence. And in doing so, we sometimes lose the cultures that were quiet. The ones that lived with the land, not on top of it. The ones that left no empire, only footprints and fading pigment on stone. This is the story of the Green Sahara's afterlife, not in DNA or material culture, but in the uncomfortable realization that we have almost forgotten it entirely. From around 3,000 years before the Common Era onward, the Sahara as we know it took shape. The rains had largely gone, the grasslands retreated to the Sahel. Human settlement in the interior plummeted, and in the absence of water, most things, organic matter, artifacts, memory, either moved or disappeared. And with that disappearance came a curious erasure, not the erasure of war or deliberate destruction, but a quieter one, an archival vanishing. Because the peoples of the Green Sahara did not leave writing, later societies could not refer to them. Egyptian scribes did not describe the cattle herders of Libya's interior. Greek historians did not catalog Saharan lake dwellers. Roman geographers wrote of deserts and oases, but not of vanished savannah cultures. And so, gradually, they became invisible. Not because they never existed, but because they did not fit into the frameworks that future civilizations use to define history. This is where preservation bias begins to shape the narrative. In archaeology, what survives is often what was durable: stone, metal, fired pottery. But what if your culture didn't use those materials? What if your dwellings were made of thatch and bone and skin? What if your tools were simple, your structures ephemeral, your lives deeply seasonal? In many ways, the Green Sahara's inhabitants were successful precisely because they lived lightly. They moved with the climate, adapted to shifting lakes, and built with what was renewable. But that adaptability leaves little for us to dig up. And so, centuries later, when early archaeologists began defining civilization, they did so with criteria that excluded people like these: monumentality, urban density, agricultural intensification. None of these applied to the pastoralists and foragers of the Holocene Sahara. They had no palaces, no royal graves, no cities aligned to the stars, and so they were filed away, when mentioned at all, as prehistory. A word that sounds neutral, but in practice often means not important enough. But this framing tells us more about ourselves than it does about them. The Green Sahara's people did not vanish. They simply did not write. And because we privileged writing as the marker of cultural memory, we overlooked everything else. Cave art was dismissed as decoration. Hearth remains were seen as domestic debris, not ritual. A burial beneath a rock shelter was not a sign of worldview, but merely a data point. The richness of their existence was minimized by our lack of imagination and by the fragility of their materials. Even today, when satellite imagery and sediment cores and ancient genomes are restoring parts of the picture, there remains a cultural gap. Most people have never heard of the Green Sahara. It is rarely taught. It does not appear in lists of early civilizations. There is no chapter between Mesopotamia and the Indus that says, also, there were lakes and paintings and herders in what is now desert. Somehow that part got skipped. And yet, maybe this is a good moment to ask why. Why do we require writing to validate a people? Why is agriculture considered more advanced than sustainable fishing? Why must a culture build monuments in stone to be remembered? These are not scientific questions. They are anthropological ones, and they reflect the lenses through which we, the descendants of industrial societies, view the past. The irony, of course, is that our civilization may be easier to find than to understand. Concrete will survive us. Plastics will drift in the oceans for millennia. But understanding what we meant, what we felt, will be harder. And perhaps we should extend that same humility backward. The Saharan cultures of the Holocene are difficult to reconstruct not because they were simple, but because they were fleeting. They mastered a landscape that has since turned to dust. They lived where now it is almost impossible to live. And they left signs of beauty, intention, and care in the one medium still visible, the rocks. Rock art may not be writing, but it speaks. It tells us of giraffes, now vanished from those latitudes, of cattle and dancing, of human forms in motion, of something that felt worth drawing again and again across thousands of years. These images were not idle scribbles. They were language in another key. And while they do not tell us names or dynasties, they tell us that someone was there, someone who saw and remembered and translated the world into pigment and gesture. If we measure a civilization only by its architecture or bureaucracy, the Green Sahara will always come up short. But if we measure it by resilience, adaptability, and the ability to thrive in a land that later turned lethal, it begins to look like a triumph, a civilization not lost, but temporarily buried, misclassified, mistaken for absence. This should make us reconsider what it means to vanish from history. The people of the Sahara did not disappear. Their presence is written in pollen records and lithic scatter and mitochondrial base pairs. But those are not the records we taught ourselves to value. And so, even now, they remain half seen. The silence between civilizations is not always a void. Sometimes it's a pause, a long breath, a memory waiting to be remembered. The Green Sahara was a chapter left out not because it was unimportant, but because it was hard to hear. And perhaps that is the real challenge, to train ourselves to listen, not just to empires and cities, but to the quieter stories, the ones told by water stains in ancient lake beds, by forgotten genes in modern blood, by the faint red outline of a swimming human on the ceiling of a cave. So how do we remember a people who didn't leave kings? Maybe we start by questioning the throne, and by understanding that silence too is part of the human story. There are places on this planet where memory dissolves, where time no longer clings to stone, where stories cannot hold their shape, and the past vanishes not through violence, but through wind. The Sahara is one of them. A desert so vast it can erase cities. A silence so large it humbles even our technologies. And somewhere within that silence, beneath thousands of years of drifting sand, there remains a world we will never fully recover. It is strange to think that the largest desert on Earth was once a place of rain, that lakes once pulsed across these plains, that cattle grazed, children swam, and fires were lit beneath skies now dry beyond imagining. The Sahara has not always been what we call it. It was not always death-colored, not always a boundary. There were mornings here, music, movement, names we'll never say. But that is the nature of deep time. It takes more than it gives. And the archaeologist's brush, the satellite's lens, even the genome's coil of code, all of them struggle to rebuild what sand has made holy. Because this isn't just the story of what happened, it's the story of what was lost, and of how, in the end, we are all just visitors in a landscape that remembers differently than we do. There's something haunting about the fact that the Green Sahara did not fall with a bang. There was no apocalypse, no sudden collapse, only the return of what had always waited. The rain ceased, slowly. The grasses shriveled, the herds dwindled, and the people, one by one, moved. No fanfare, no inscription, just absence growing where abundance had been. And what they left behind, paintings, bones, ash rings, were not designed to last. They were the byproducts of living, not announcements of greatness. Yet somehow, fragments survived. The curve of a jaw, the shape of a hearth, a figure drawn in ochre, arms raised in an eternal swim. These are not enough to build a full civilization, but they are more than nothing, and perhaps they are enough. Because in the end, maybe knowledge isn't always the goal. Maybe it's attention. Maybe the point isn't to understand everything, but to sit with the wonder of it. To know that for thousands of years, in what is now considered wasteland, there was life as rich and intricate as any we've celebrated. And to accept, without bitterness, that most of it is gone. This doesn't mean the effort was in vain. Every core sample, every stratigraphic layer, every decoding of a long-degraded molecule brings us closer, not to the full picture, but to a reverence for its absence. We learn not only what the past contained, but how delicately it must be held. And we begin to see history not as a lit museum hall, but as a flickering fire in the dark, casting glimpses of something enormous, just beyond the flame. In a way, this is the perfect place to end, not with certainty, but with space. Not with an answer, but with the quiet recognition that some stories are meant to remain unfinished. The Sahara is still here. It hasn't stopped keeping its secrets, and maybe that's all right. If you listen closely, you might still hear something. Not words, not voices, just a presence. The sense that someone once stood here before you, looking at the same stars, feeling the same wind, holding the same need to remember. They are gone, but not gone. Buried, but not erased. The world that was green still exists, in shadows and echoes and dust, and in us. Because when we look at the desert now, we no longer see emptiness. We see depth, layers, questions, the imprint of lives lived without needing to be noticed. And that, in its own way, is a kind of immortality. So will we ever truly know who they were? Probably not. But maybe knowing they were here is enough. Maybe that is the kind of story we're supposed to carry, not to solve, but to respect. A story without a hero, without a villain, just people and rain and time. And beneath it all, the sand. Still moving, still keeping, still waiting.